For a moment he stood silent regarding the child with the same weary expression, but suddenly a smile wrinkling the skin on his forehead and making his hair move lit up his face, and he quietly left the room. He rang the bell in the dining room and told the servant to send for the doctor. Once more he was vexed with his wife for not troubling about the charming baby, felt disinclined to go in and see her while in that frame of mind, and also disinclined to meet the Princess Betsy. But his wife might think it strange if he did not come in as usual, and so he mastered himself and went to her bedroom. Stepping on the soft carpet as he approached the door, he involuntarily overheard a conversation which he had no wish to hear. If he had not been going away, I should understand your refusal, and his too, but your husband must be above that. Betsy was saying, it is not for my husband's sake, but for my own that I don't wish it. Don't talk about it, answered Anna in an excited voice. Yes, but you can't but wish to say goodbye to a man who tried to shoot himself for your sake. It's just for that reason that I don't wish it. Karenin, with a frightened and guilty face, stopped short and thought of returning unnoticed. But coming to the conclusion that this would be undignified, he turned, coughed, and went toward the bedroom door. The voices were silent, and he entered Anna in a gray dressing gown with her black hair cropped short, but already growing again. Like a thick brush over her round head, sat on a couch as usual. When she saw her husband, all her animation vanished from her face. She bowed her head and glanced uneasily at Betsy. Betsy, dressed in the very latest fashion, her hat soaring high above her head like a little chimney coronet over a lamp, in a dove-colored dress with very pronounced diagonal stripes going one way on the bodice and the other way on the skirt, was sitting beside Anna, her flat, tall figure very erect, and her head bent. She met Karenin with an ironical smile. Ah, she exclaimed as if in surprise, I am so glad you are at home. I have not seen you since Anna's illness. I have heard everything, all about your attentiveness. Yes, you are a wonderful husband, she said with a significant and affable expression, as if she were conferring on him an order of high-mindedness for his conduct toward his wife. Karenin bowed coldly and, kissing his wife's hand, asked about her health. I think I'm better, she said, avoiding his eyes. But your face looks feverish, said he, emphasizing the word feverish. We have been talking too much, said Betsy. I know it was selfish of me, and I am going. She rose, but Anna, suddenly blushing quickly, seized her hand. No, please stay. I must tell you, and she turned toward her husband, the color spreading over her neck and forehead. I don't wish to hide anything from you. Karenin cracked his fingers and bowed his head. Betsy says Count Vonksy wanted to come and say goodbye before leaving for Tashkent. She was not looking at her husband and evidently was in a hurry to get through what she meant to say at any cost. I said I could not receive him. You said, my love, that it would depend on Alexei Alexandrovich. Betsy corrected her. Oh no, I can't receive him, and it would lead. She stopped suddenly and glanced inquiringly at her husband, who was not looking at her. In a word, I don't wish. Karenin drew nearer and was going to take her hand. Her first impulse was to draw away her hand from his moist one with the thick swelling veins that was seeking hers. But with evident effort she pressed it. I am very grateful for your confidence. But he began in confusion, feeling with vexation that what he could so clearly decide within himself he was unable to discuss in the presence of the Princess Tverskaya, who appeared to him the personification of that coarse power which would rule his life in the eye of the world, and which prevented him from yielding to his feelings of love and forgiveness. He stopped and looked at the princess. Well, goodbye, my precious, said Betsy, rising again. She kissed Anna and went out. Karenin followed her. Alexei Alexandrovich, I know you to be a really high-minded man, said Betsy, stopping short in the little sitting room and once again pressing his hand with peculiar warmth. I am only an outsider, but I'm so fond of her and respect you so much that I will take the liberty of advising you receive him. Alexei Vronsky is honor personified, and besides he is leaving for Tashkent. Thanks for your sympathy and advice, princess. But the question whom my wife will and whom she will not receive, she will decide for herself. He said this from force of habit with a dignified raising of his eyebrows, but immediately remembered that whatever he might say, there could be no question of dignity in his position, and saw the confirmation of this in the suppressed, cruel, and ironical smile with which Betsy glanced at him When he had spoken chapter 20, Karenin took leave of Betsy. When they reached the dining room and returned to his wife, she was lying down, but on hearing his step she quickly sat up in her former place and glanced at him with apprehension. He saw that she had been crying. "I am very grateful to you for your confidence." He repeated in Russian what he had said in French in Betsy's presence. When speaking Russian to her, he called her thou, and that always irritated her. "And I am very grateful for your decision. To think that as he is going away there is no need whatever for Count Vronsky to come here. However, but I have already said so." "Then why?" repeated Anna, suddenly interrupted him with an irritation she could not repress. "No need whatever," she thought, "for a man to come and take leave of a woman he loves, for whose sake he wanted to die, and has ruined himself. A woman who cannot live without him. No need whatever." And she pressed her lips together and lowered her glistening eyes, looking at his hands with their swollen veins, which he was slowly rubbing together. "Let us say no more about it," she added more calmly. "I left it to you to decide the matter, and I am very glad to see," began Karenin, "that my wish coincides with yours." She rapidly completed his sentence. Exasperated by the slowness with which he spoke, and knowing beforehand what he would say, he assented yes, and Princess Thirsia's intrusion into this most difficult family matter is entirely out of place, especially as I don't believe anything they say about her," Anna put in quickly. "I know that she is sincerely fond of me." Karenin sighed and paused. She was agitatedly toying with the tassels of her dressing gown, glancing at him with that tormenting feeling of physical repulsion for which she blamed herself, but which she could not overcome. The one thing she was longing for was to get rid of his obnoxious presence. "I have just sent for the doctor," said he. "I am quite well." "Why should I need the doctor?" "Yes, but the little one keeps screaming, and they say the nurse has not enough milk." "Then why would you not let me nurse her when I entreated you to?" "She is a child anyhow." He understood what she meant by that anyhow, "and they will kill her." She rang and ordered the baby to be brought. "I asked to be allowed to nurse her, and I wasn't. And now I am blamed." "I don't blame." "Yes, you are blaming me. Oh God, why did I not die?" And she began to sob. "Forgive me. I am upset. I am unjust." She went on, controlling herself. "But no, it can't go on like that," he told himself with conviction. After leaving his wife, never before had his impossible situation, as the world thought it, his wife's hatred and the strength of that coarse power, which in direct opposition to his inward mood dominated his life and demanded fulfillment of its decrees, and a change in his relation to his wife. Never before had the impossibility of his position appeared so evident. He saw clearly that the world and also his wife were demanding something from him, but exactly what this something was he did not comprehend. All this was arousing a feeling of animosity in his soul, spoiling his peace of mind and depriving his achievement of all value. He considered it better for Anna to break off her relations with Vronsky. But if everyone thought this impossible, he was even ready to allow those relations to be renewed so long as no slur was thereby cast on the children. He was not deprived of them, and his position was not altered. Bad as this would be, it would be preferable to a complete rupture, which would place her in a hopeless and shameful position and deprive him of all he loved. But he felt powerless. He was aware in advance that everybody would be against him, and that he would not be allowed to do what now seemed so natural and good, that he would be obliged to do what was wrong. But what seemed to them necessary? Chapter 21. Before Betsy had passed out of the dining room, Oblonsky, who had just come from Alisiev's where newly arrived oysters were to be, had met her in the doorway. "Ah, Princess, what a pleasure to meet you," he began. "And I have been at your house. We meet only for a moment." "As I am just going," said Betsy, smiling and putting on her glove. "Wait a little, Princess. Before putting on your glove, let me kiss your hand. There is nothing for which I am more thankful than for the revival of the old custom of hand-kissing." And he kissed Betsy's hand. "When shall I see you again?" "You are not worth it," said Betsy, smiling. "Yes, I am well worth it, because I have become the most serious of men. I not only settle my own, but other people's family affairs," said he with a significant glance. "Oh, I am very glad," said Betsy, at once understanding that he referred to Anna. She returned to the dining room with him, and they stood together in a corner. "He will kill her," said Betsy in a significant Whisper, this is impossible, impossible. I'm very glad you think so, returned Oblonsky, shaking his head with an expression of grave woebegone commiseration. That is why I have come to Petersburg. The whole town is talking of it. She said it is an impossible situation. She is fading away, fading away. He does not understand that she is one of those women who cannot play with their feelings. One of two things must happen. Either he must take her away acting energetically, or he must divorce her. But all this is stifling her. Yes, yes, exactly, said Oblonsky, sighing. I have come because of that. I mean, not entirely because of it. I have been made chamberlain and had to tender my thanks. But the chief thing is to get this affair settled well. Then may God help you, said Betsy, having seen her down to the hall and again kissed her hand a little above the glove, just where the pulse beat, and having told her some rubbish so daring that she did not know whether to be angry or to laugh. Oblonsky went to his sister's room. He found her in tears, though he was overflowing with high spirits. Oblonsky immediately fell into a sympathetic and romantic mood suited to hers, inquired after her health, and asked how she had spent the morning. Very, very badly this afternoon and morning and all other days past and future, she replied. I think you give way to melancholy. You should rouse yourself and look life straight in the face. I know it is hard, but I have heard it said that women love men for their very faults. Anna began suddenly. But I hate him for his virtues. I cannot live with him. Try and realize that even his looks have a physical effect on me and drive me beside myself. I cannot live with him. What am I to do? I was unhappy and thought it impossible to be more so, but I could never have imagined such a terrible position as I am now in. Will you believe it, knowing that he is a kind and generous man, that I am not worth his little finger? Nevertheless, I hate him. I hate him for his generosity. There is nothing left for me. But she was going to say death, but he did not let her finish. You are ill and excited, said he. Believe me, you're greatly exaggerating the case. There is nothing so very terrible about it. Oblonsky smiled. No one else in his place, having to deal with such despair, would have permitted himself to smile, for a smile would have appeared callous. But in his smile there was so much kindness and almost feminine tenderness that it was not offensive, but soothing and pacifying. His soft, comforting words and smiles had as soothing and calming an effect as almond oil, and Anna soon felt this. No, Steva, said she, I am lost, quite lost, and even worse than lost. I am not lost yet. I cannot say all is finished. On the contrary, I feel that all is not yet finished, and like a tightly strung cord which must break. But all is not finished, and it will end in some dreadful manner. Oh, no one can loosen the string gently. There is no situation from which there is no escape. I've been thinking, and thinking only one. Again he understood from her frightened face that she considered death to be the only escape, and did not let her finish. Not at all, he replied. Listen, you can't see your position, as I can. Let me tell you my frank opinion. Again he smiled his almond oil smile. I will begin at the beginning. You married a man 20 years older than yourself. You married without love, and without having known love. That was a mistake, I grant, a dreadful mistake, said Anna. But again I say that is an accomplished fact. Next, let us admit that you had the misfortune to fall in love not with your husband. That is a misfortune, but that too is an accomplished fact. Your husband has accepted that and forgiven you. He paused between each sentence, expecting her to make objections, but she made no answer. That is so. Now comes the question, can you go on living with your husband? Do you wish it? Does he wish it? I don't know at all, but you yourself say you cannot endure him. No, I did not say so. I take back those words. I know nothing, I understand nothing. Yes, but let me. You can't understand. I feel that I'm flying headlong over some precipice, but must not even try to save myself. And I can't. Never mind, we'll spread out something to catch you. I understand that you cannot take it upon yourself to express your wishes and feelings. I have no wishes at all, except that everything were at an end, and he sees that and knows it. Do you think it weighs on him less than on you? You suffer and he suffers. What can come of that? Well, a divorce would solve the whole problem, said Oblonsky, not without difficulty expressing his main idea, and looking at her significantly. She replied only by shaking her cropped head, but by the expression of her face suddenly illuminated with its old beauty, he saw that the only reason she did not wish for this solution was because it seemed to her an impossible happiness. I am dreadfully sorry for you both. How happy I should be if I could arrange it, continued Oblonsky, now smiling more boldly. Don't say a word. If only God helps me to say what I feel, I shall go to him. Anna looked at him with dreamy shining eyes, but said nothing. Chapter 22. Oblonsky, with the same rather solemn expression with which he was wont to take the chair at council meetings, entered Karenin's study. Karenin, with his arms crossed behind him, was pacing up and down, meditating on the very subject that his wife and Oblonsky had been discussing. "I'm not disturbing you?" asked Oblonsky, experiencing at the sight of his brother-in-law a feeling of embarrassment quite unusual with him. To hide that embarrassment, he took out a cigarette case with a new kind of fastening, which he had only just bought, smelt the leather of which it was made, and took out a cigarette. "Now, do you want anything?" Karenin answered reluctantly. "Yes, I wish I must have a talk with you," said Oblonsky, surprised at his own unaccustomed timidity. That timidity was so unexpected and strange that Oblonsky could not believe it was his conscience telling him that what he was about to do was wrong. He made an effort and conquered it. "I hope you believe in my affection for my sister and my sincere attachment and respect for yourself," said he, flushing. Karenin stopped. He made no reply, but the expression of submissive self-sacrifice on his face struck Oblonsky. "I intended to talk to you about my sister and your mutual position," said Oblonsky, still struggling with his unwanted timidity. Karenin smiled sadly, looked at his brother-in-law, and without replying went to the table and took from it an unfinished letter which he handed to him. "I think about that subject incessantly, and this is what I have begun to write, as I think I can put it better in writing, and my presence is distasteful to her," he said, holding out the letter. Oblonsky took the letter, looked with perplexed amazement at the dull eyes fixed on him, and began reading. "I see that my presence is distasteful to you. Hard as it was for me to assure myself of this, I see that it is so, and there is no help for it. I do not blame you, and God is my witness that when I saw you ill, I resolved with my whole soul to forget everything that had come between us, and to begin a new life. I do not repent, and never shall repent of what I did, as my only desire was for your welfare, the welfare of your soul. But now I see that I have not succeeded. Tell me yourself what would give you real happiness and peace of mind. I submit myself entirely to your wishes and sense of justice." Oblonsky returned the letter and went on looking at his brother-in-law with the same amazement, not knowing what to say. That silence was so disconcerting to both that Oblonsky's lips twitched painfully as he silently and fixedly gazed at Karenin's face. "That is what I wanted to tell her," said Karenin, as he turned away. "Yes, yes," said Oblonsky, tears choking him and preventing his reply. "Yes, yes, I understand you," he brought out at last. "I must know what she wants," said Karenin. "I am afraid she does not understand her position herself. She is no judge of it," replied Oblonsky, growing more composed. "She is crushed, literally crushed by your generosity. If she reads this letter, she will not have the strength to say anything. She will only hang her head lower than ever." "Yes, but under these circumstances, how is an explanation to be arrived at? How am I to find out what she wishes? If you will permit me to express my opinion, I think it is for you to say what you think should be done in order to put an end to this state of affairs." "Then you think that an end should be put to it?" Karenin interrupted him. "But how," he added, moving his hands before his eyes in a manner unusual with him. "I don't see any possible way out." "There's a way out of every situation," said Oblonsky, rising and growing excited. "There was a time when you wished to break with her. Should you be now convinced that you cannot make each other mutually happy? Happiness can be defined so differently. However, I am ready to agree to anything. I want nothing at all. What way out is there in our case? If you wish to know my opinion," said Oblonsky with the same soothing, Armandi tender smile with which he had addressed Anna. A kindly smile so convincing that Karenin, conscious of his own weakness and yielding to it, was involuntarily ready to believe anything Oblonsky should say. She would never say so. "But there is one way out. One thing she might wish it would be to terminate your relations and everything that reminds her of them. As I look at it in your case, it is necessary to clear up your newly arisen relation to one another, and this new relation can only be established when both are free." Divorce, Karenin interrupted with disgust. Yes, divorce, I think. Yes, divorce, Oblonsky answered, reddening. That would be the most reasonable way from every point of view. With a couple placed as you are, what is to be done? If they find out that life together has become impossible, as might happen anywhere. Karenin sighed heavily and closed his eyes. There is only one thing to consider. Does either party wish to remarry? If not, it is very simple. Went on Oblonsky, gradually overcoming his embarrassment. Karenin, his face drawn with distress, muttered something to himself and made no reply. He had considered 1,000 times all this which appeared so simple to Oblonsky, and it seemed to him not only far from simple, but altogether impossible. An action for divorce, with the details of which he was now acquainted, seemed impossible because a feeling of self-respect and his regard for religion would not allow him to plead guilty to a fictitious act of adultery, and still less to allow the wife he had forgiven and whom he loved to be indicted and disgraced for other and yet more important reasons. Also, divorce seemed out of the question. In case of a divorce, what would become of his son? To leave him with his mother was not possible. The divorced mother would have another, an illegitimate family, in which the position and education of a stepson would in all probability be a bad one should he keep him himself. He knew that would be revengeful, and he did not wish for revenge. But besides all this, what made divorce seem to Karenin more impossible than any other course was that by consenting to it, he would by that very act ruin Anna. What Dolly had said in Moscow, to the effect that in considering a divorce, he was thinking of himself and not of Anna, who would then be irretrievably lost, had sunk into his heart, and having connected these words with his forgiveness and with his attachment to the children, he now understood them in his own way. To agree to a divorce, to give her her freedom, would mean, as he looked at it, to deprive himself of the only thing that bound him to life, the children he loved, and to deprive her of the last support on the path of virtue, and cast her to perdition. As a divorced wife, she would form a union with Vronsky, which would be both illegal and criminal, because according to the law of the church, a wife may not remarry as long as her husband is living. She will form a union with him, and within a year or two, he will either abandon her or she will unite with someone else, thought Karenin, and I, by consenting to an illegal divorce, shall be the cause of her ruin. Hundreds of times he had thought it over and had come to the conclusion that a divorce was not merely less simple than his brother-in-law considered it, but quite out of the question. He did not believe a word of what Oblonsky was saying, and for all his arguments had scores of refutations ready. Yet he listened, feeling that those words expressed that coarse and mighty power which overruled his life and to which he would have to submit. The only question is on what conditions you will agree to a divorce. Or she does not want anything, does not ask for anything, but leaves all to your generosity. Oh God, how have I deserved this, thought Karenin, recalling the particulars of a divorce suit in which the husband took all the blame on himself, and with the same ashamed gesture with which Vronsky had covered his face, he hid his own in his hands. You are upset, I quite understand, but if you consider, whosoever shall smite thee on thy right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if any man will take away thy coat, let him have thy cloak also, thought Karenin. Yes, yes, he cried in a shrill voice, I will take the disgrace and even give up my son. But had we not better let it alone? However, do as you like. And turning away so that his brother-in-law should not see his face, he sat down on a chair by the window. It was very bitter, and he felt ashamed, yet mixed with the bitterness and the shame he felt a sense of joy and emotion at the greatness of his own humility. Oblonsky was touched. He remained silent for a while. Alexey Alexandrovich, believe me, she will esteem your generosity, said he, but evidently it was God's will, he added, and having said it, felt how silly it was and could hardly help smiling at his own stupidity. Karenin would have answered, but could not for his tears. It is a fatal disaster and has to be faced. I regard this disaster as an accomplished fact, and I'm trying to help both you and her, Oblonsky went on. When he left his brother-in-law's room, Oblonsky was touched, but this feeling did not spoil his contentment at having successfully arranged the matter, for he was certain that Alexey Alexandrovich would not go back on his word. To his contentment was added an idea that had just occurred to him when the affair was all settled. He would ask his wife and intimate friends a riddle: what is the difference between me and a chemist? Answer: a chemist makes solutions which do not make anyone happy, but I have made a dissolution and made 3 people happy. Or why am I like a chemist when, however, I will improve on it later, he said to himself with a smile. Chapter 23. Although Vronsky's wound had missed the heart, it was dangerous, and for several days he lay between life and death when he was first able to talk again. His brother's wife Varia was alone with him. Varia, he said, looking sternly at her, it went off accidentally. Never speak of it, please, and tell everybody else that, or else it would be too stupid. Without saying a word, Varia bent over him and looked in his face with a joyful smile. His eyes were clear and no longer feverish, but their expression was stern. Well, thank God, she exclaimed, you are not in pain a little here? And he pointed to his chest. Then let me change the bandage. He looked at her silently, his broad jaws set, while she bandaged him. When she had finished, he said, I am not delirious. Please arrange so that no one shall say that I shot myself on purpose. But no one does say so only. I hope you will not go letting it off accidentally anymore, said she with an inquiring smile. I expect I shan't, but it would have been better. And he smiled gloomily despite these words, and that smile which greatly perturbed Varia when the inflammation left him and he became convalescent. He felt that he had rid himself entirely of one part of his grief by his action. He seemed to have washed off the shame and degradation he had previously felt. Now he could think quietly about Karenin, fully realizing his generosity without being humiliated thereby. Besides that, he got into his old rut again. He found he could look people in the face once more, and he was able to live in accord with his former habits. The one thing he could not tear out of his heart, although he continually struggled against it, was a regret bordering on despair at having lost Anna forever, that now, having atoned for his guilt toward her husband, he would be obliged to give her up and never place himself between her with her remorse and her husband was clear to his mind. But he could not eradicate from his heart her regret for the loss of her love, could not efface from his memory the moments of happiness he had known with her, moments he had valued so lightly, but the image of which with all their charm pursued him. Still, Serpukhowsky thought out a post for him in Tashkent, and Vronsky accepted the proposition without the least hesitation. But the nearer the hour for his departure approached, the harder seemed the sacrifice he was making to what he considered his duty. His wound was quite healed, and he went about making preparations for his journey to Tashkent, only to see her once more, and then to bury myself to die, he thought as he was making a round of farewell calls. And he expressed this thought to Betsy. It was with this message that Betsy went to Anna, and she brought him an answer in the negative. So much the better, thought Vronsky when he heard it. It would have been a weakness, would have taken away all the strength I have left. Next day, Betsy herself came and announced that she had received through Oblonsky the definite news that Karenin consented to a divorce, and that therefore Vronsky might see Anna without so much as taking the trouble of seeing Betsy to the door, or of asking when he could see Anna and where her husband was. Vronsky, in spite of all of his resolutions, at once went to the Karenins without seeing anyone or anything. He ran up the stairs and entered her room with hurried steps, almost at a run, without thinking or considering whether they were alone or not. He embraced her and covered her face, hands, and neck with kisses. Anna had prepared herself for this meeting and had thought about what she would say to him, but she had no time to say any of it. Seized by his passion, she wished to calm him and herself, but it was too late. His passion communicated itself to her. Her lip trembled so that for a long time she could not speak. Yes, you have taken possession of me, and I am yours, she brought out at last, pressing his hands to her bosom. It had to be said. He is long as we live, it will have to be now. I am sure of it. It is true, she said, growing paler and paler, putting her arms about his head. Still, there is something terrible in this. After what has been, it will pass, it will all pass, and we shall be so happy. If our love could be stronger, there being something terrible in it would make it so, he said, raising his head with a smile that showed his fine teeth. She could not help smiling in answer not to his words, But to his enamored eyes she took his hand and stroked with it her cold cheek and cropped hair. "I don't know you. With this short hair you have improved. So you little boy, how pale you are." "Yes, I feel very weak," she said with a smile, and her lip trembled. Again. "We shall go to Italy, and you will soon get well," said he. "Is it possible that we should be like husband and wife alone, a family, you and I?" she said, looking closely into his eyes. "I am only surprised that it could ever have been otherwise. Steva says he will agree to anything, but I cannot accept his generosity," she said dreamily, gazing past Bronsky's face. "I don't want a divorce. Nothing matters to me now, only I don't know what to decide about Saretta." He was quite unable to understand how she could at the moment of their first reunion think about her son and divorce. "As if all that were not immaterial. Don't talk and don't think about it," he said, playing with her hand and trying to draw her attention to himself. But she continued to gaze past him. "Oh, why did I not die? It would have been best," she said, the tears streaming noiselessly down her cheeks. But unwilling to pain him, she tried to smile. To refuse the flattering offer of a post at Tashkent, which was a dangerous one, would have seemed disgraceful and impossible according to Vronsky's former views. But now, without a moment's hesitation, he did refuse it, and observing that his superiors frowned upon his action, at once resigned his commission. A month later, Karenin and his son were left alone in the house, and Anna went abroad with Vronsky, not only without getting a divorce, but having resolutely refused it. Part 5, Chapter 1. The Princess Shtcherbatskaya at first considered it out of the question to have the wedding before Advent, to which there remained but 5 weeks, but could not help agreeing with Levin that to put it off until after the fast might involve waiting too long, for Prince Shtcherbatsky's old aunt was very ill and likely to die soon, and then the family would be in mourning, and the wedding would have to be considerably deferred. Consequently, having decided to divide her daughter's trousseau into 2 parts, a lesser and a larger, the princess eventually consented to have the wedding before Advent. She decided that she would have the smaller part of the trousseau got ready at once and would send on the larger part later, and she was very cross with Levin because he could not give her a serious answer to her question whether he agreed with this arrangement or not. This plan would be all the more convenient because the young couple intended immediately after the wedding to go to the country where the larger part of the trousseau would not be required. Levin continued in the same condition of delirium as before, imagining that he and his joy were the chief for only purpose of all existence, and that he need not now think or bother about anything, as other people would see to everything for him. He had not even any plans or aims for the future, but left these 2 others to decide, quite sure that everything would turn out splendidly. His brother Sergei Ivanovich Oblonsky and the princess directed his actions. He quite agreed to every proposal. His brother borrowed money for him. The princess advised him to return to the country after the wedding, and Oblonsky suggested going abroad. He agreed to everything. "Do whatever you like, whatever pleases you. I am happy, and my happiness cannot be made or marred by anything you do," he thought when he told Kitty of Oblonsky's advice that they should go abroad. He was quite surprised at her opposition to it, and to find that she had definite ideas of her own about their future life. She knew that in the country Levin had work of which he was fond, as he saw. She not only did not understand that work, but did not wish to understand it. This, however, did not prevent her considering it very important, and besides, she knew their home would be in the country, and she wanted to go not abroad, where they were not going to live, but to where her home would be. This decided expression of her wish surprised Levin, but as it was quite immaterial to him, he at once begged Oblonsky to go to the house in the country, just as if it were Oblonsky's duty to go and arrange everything there according to his own good taste. "I say," Oblonsky asked Yevgen one day after his return from the country, where he had made all preparations for the young couple, "have you got a certificate to show that you have received communion?" "No, why?" "Well, they won't marry you without it." "Oh dear," exclaimed Levin, "I think it is 9 years since I went to communion. I haven't thought about it." "You are a good one," remarked Oblonsky, laughing, "and you call me a nihilist, but it won't. Do you know you must confess and receive the sacrament when there are only 4 days left, but Oblonsky arranged that too. Livan began to prepare himself to him as an agnostic who yet respected the religious beliefs of others. It was always very trying to be present at or to take part in any religious ceremony, and his present state of mind, softened and sensitive to everything, to be obliged to pretend was not only trying, but appeared impossible now. In his state of triumph at the flowering time of his life, he was to be obliged to lie or blaspheme. He felt unable to do either, but questioned Oblonsky as he would as to whether he could not obtain a certificate without going to communion. Oblonsky declared that he must go through with it. Besides, what does it amount to 2 days? And the priest is such a nice old man, he will draw that tooth for you, so that you will scarcely feel it. Standing in church during the first service he attended, Livan tried to revive the memories of his youth and the strong religious feeling with which at the age of 16 or 17 he had been imbued, but he immediately became convinced that it was out of his power to do so. He then tried to regard it all as a meaningless, empty custom, like making a round of calls, but felt equally unable to do that in matters of religion. Levin, like most of his contemporaries, had very indefinite views. He could not believe in it and yet was not firmly convinced that it was all false, therefore unable either to believe in the importance of what he was doing or to look upon it with indifference as an empty form. He, while preparing for confession, felt awkward and ashamed at doing something incomprehensible, and therefore, as an inner voice told him necessarily false and wrong during the service, he would sometimes listen to the prayers, trying to see in them a meaning which would not clash with his opinions, or finding that he could not understand and had to disapprove of them, he would try not to listen, but to occupy his mind with observation of what was going on, or with recollections which passed with extraordinary clearness through his brain as he stood idly in the church. He stood through the Mass and Vespers and even song, and the next day, having got up earlier than usual, he went to church before breakfast to hear morning prayers and to confess. No one else was in the church except a soldier beggar to old women and the clergy. The young deacon, the two halves of his long back clearly distinguishable through his thin under cassock, met him, and going at once to a small table beside the wall, began reading the prayers. While he was reading, and especially during the frequent and rapid repetitions of "Lord have mercy upon us," which sounded like "Lord mercy pons," Livan felt as if his mind were closed and sealed up, and that if he did make it stir now, nothing but confusion would result. Therefore, as he stood behind the deacon, he continued his own train of thought without listening or trying to comprehend what was being read. How wonderfully expressive her hand, as he thought, recalling how they had sat at the corner table the day before. As was nearly always the case, just then they had nothing to say to each other, and she had put her hand on the table and kept opening and closing it until she herself began to laugh at its motions. He remembered how he had kissed the hand, and afterwards examined the converging lines on the rosy palm again. "Lord of mercy," thought he, crossing himself, bowing, and watching the movements of the bowing deacon's flexible back. Then she took my hand and examined the lines and said, "You have a splendid hand." And he glanced at the deacon's stumpy hand and at his own. "Well, it will soon be over now," he thought. "No, I believe it is all going to begin again." And he listened to the prayer. "Yes, it is coming to an end there." He is bowing down to the ground. That always happens just before the end. Having stealthily received a 3-ruble note into his hand under its velvet cuff, the deacon said he would put down Levin's name and went briskly into the chancel, his new boots clattering over the paved floor of the empty church. A minute later, he put his head out and beckoned to Levin. The sealed-up thoughts began stirring in Levin's head, but he hastened to drive them away. "It will get settled somehow," he thought, and went to the ambo. On going up the steps and turning to the right, he saw the priest. The latter, an old man with a thin grizzled beard and kind weary eyes, stood beside the lectern, turning over the leaves of a missal. Bowing slightly to Levin, he began at once in his stereotyped tone to read the prayers. At the end he bowed to the ground and turned to Levin. "Christ, though unseen, is here present to receive your confession," he said, pointing to a crucifix. "Do you believe in the teachings of the Holy Apostolic Church?" continued the priest, turning his eyes away and folding his hands beneath his stole. "I have doubted and still doubt everything." replied Levin in a voice unpleasant to himself, and stopped. The priest paused a few seconds to see whether Levin would say anything more, and then closing his eyes said rapidly with a strong provincial accent, "Doubts are natural to human weakness, but we must pray that our merciful Lord will strengthen us. What are your particular sins?" he continued without the slightest pause, as if anxious not to waste time. "My chief sin is doubt. I doubt everything, and I'm in doubt nearly all the time." "Doubt is natural to human weakness," repeated the priest. "What do you doubt in particular?" "Everything. Sometimes I even doubt the existence of God," said Levin involuntarily, and was horrified at the impropriety of his words. But they seemed to have no effect on the priest. "What doubt can there be of the existence of God?" he asked with a faint smile. Levin was silent. "What doubt can you have of the Creator when you see His creation?" continued the priest in his rapid, stereotyped voice. "Who has adorned the vault of heaven with luminaries? Who has decked the earth with beauty? How could it all be without a Creator?" he asked with an inquiring glance at Levin. Yvain felt that it would not be proper to enter into a philosophical discussion with a priest, and therefore merely replied to the direct questions. "I don't know." "You don't know? Then how can you doubt that God created everything?" said the priest in puzzled amazement. "I don't understand it at all," said Levin, blushing and feeling that his words were silly, and that they could not but be silly. "Pray to God and entreat Him. Even the Holy Fathers doubted and prayed God to strengthen their faith. The devil is very powerful, and we must resist him. Pray to God," he repeated hurriedly. The priest paused a while, as if in thought. "I hear you are about to enter into holy matrimony with the daughter of my parishioner and spiritual son, Prince Sharbatsky," he added with a smile. "A splendid young woman." "Yes," answered Levin with a blush. For the priest, why need he ask me that? A confession, he thought, and as if in answer to the thought, the priest said, "You are about to enter into matrimony, and God may give you children. Is it not so? Then what sort of education can you give your little ones if you do not conquer in yourself the temptations of the devil who is leading you into unbelief?" he asked in mild rebuke. "If you love your offspring, then you, as a kind father, will desire not only riches, luxury, and honors for your child, but will desire his salvation, his spiritual advancement by the light of truth. Was that not so? And when your innocent little one asks, 'Papa, who has created everything that pleases me in this world? Earth, water, sun, flowers, grass,' what will you say? Will you really say to him, 'I don't know'? Well, you cannot help knowing, since God in His great mercy has revealed it to you. Your child may ask you, 'What awaits me beyond the tomb?' What will you tell him if you yourself know nothing? How will you answer him? Will you leave him to the temptations of the world and the devil that is wrong?" The priest ceased, and with his head on one side regarded Levin with mild, kindly eyes. This time Levin did not reply, not because he did not wish to enter upon a discussion with the priest, but because no one had ever yet put such questions to him, and also because before his little one could begin asking such questions, there would be plenty of time to consider what the answer should be. "You are entering upon a time of life," the priest went on, "when you must choose your path and keep to it. So pray that God in His goodness may help you and have mercy on you," he concluded. "May the Lord our God Jesus Christ and the goodness and bounty of His love for mankind pardon thee." And having pronounced the absolution, the priest blessed him and let him go. When he got home that day, Levin felt relieved at having done with an unpleasant episode in such a way that he had not been obliged to tell lies. Besides, he was left with a vague feeling that what the nice, kind old man had said to him was not as stupid as it had seemed at first, and that there was something in it that ought to be elucidated. Of course not now, thought he, but later on he felt more than ever before that there was a kind of vagueness in his soul, a want of clearness, and that with regard to religion he was in the same position that he saw so distinctly and disliked in others, and for which he found fault with his friend Sviatsky. He spent that evening with his betrothed to the Oblanskys, and was in particularly high spirits, explaining to Oblansky the state of elation he was in. He said he felt as pleased as a dog that was being taught to jump through a hoop, and which, having accomplished what was demanded of it, barks and wags its tail and jumps for joy upon the tables and window sills. Chapter 2. On his wedding day, Levin, according to custom, the princess and Dolly insisted on his strictly conforming to custom, did not see his bride, and dined at his hotel with 3 bachelors who happened to drop in Sergei Ivanich Kataversov, an old fellow student at the university, and now a professor of natural science, whom Lev had chance to meet in the street, and induced to come, and Cherkov, his best man, a Moscow magistrate, and a bear-hunting comrade of Lev's. The dinner was a very merry one. Sergei Ivanovich was in the best of spirits, and was tickled by Katavasov's originality. Katavasov, feeling that his originality was observed and appreciated, showed it off. Chichikov gaily and good-naturedly backed up everyone else there now, said Katavasov with a drawl, a habit he had fallen into when lecturing. What a talented fellow our friend Konstantin Demetrius used to be. I am speaking of one who is not with us, because he is no more in those days. He loved science when he left the university. He had human interests, but now half his talents are bent on self-deception, and the other half toward justification of that deception. I have never come across a more decided foe of marriage than yourself, remarked Sergei Varnish. No, I am no foe of marriage, but I believe in division of labor. Persons who can do nothing else must make men, and the others must help them to culture and happiness. That is how I look at it. There are hosts of aspirants who aim at mixing those two professions, but I am not one of them. How delighted I shall be when I hear of your falling in love, said Livan. Pray invite me to your wedding. I am in love already. Yes, with a mollusk. Do you know, said Liavin, turning to his brother Katavarsov, is writing a work on nutriment. And oh, don't confuse matters. What does it matter what I write about? The fact is, I really do love mollusks, but they would not prevent you loving a wife. They would not, but the wife would. Why no, you'll soon find out. Now you like farming sport. Well, you just wait and see. You know, our hip came today to say that in Prudna there are lots of elk and bears, said Chichikov. Well, you'll have to get them without me. There you are, said Sergei Ivanovich. Goodbye to bear hunting in future. Your wife won't allow it. Levin smiled. The idea that his wife would not allow it seemed so agreeable that he was prepared to forego the pleasure of ever setting eyes on a bear again. All the same, it's a pity that those two bears will be killed without you. Do you remember that time in Hopyovka? What fine sport we had, said Cherikov. Levin did not wish to deprive him of the illusion that somewhere there could be something good without her. Therefore he said nothing. His custom of taking leave of celibacy is not without its reason, said Sergei Ivanovich. However happy you may be, you can't help regretting your freedom. Now confess that you feel like the bridegroom in Gogol's play, who jumped out of the window, teased Chichikov. Of course he feels so, but won't own up, said Katavasov, and burst out laughing. While the window is open, let us be off to Tver. One is a she-bear. We can go straight for the lair. Yes, let's catch the 5 o'clock train and leave them to do as they please here, said Chertikov, smiling. I am ready to swear I can't find in my soul a trace of regret for my freedom, said Levin with a smile. But your soul is in such chaos at the present moment that you are unable to find anything there. Wait till you settle down a bit, then you'll find it, said Katavasov. No, I should even now have some consciousness that despite my feelings, he did not wish in Katavasov's presence to use the word love in my happiness. I was yet sorry to lose my freedom, but quite on the contrary, it is precisely of this loss of freedom that I am glad. Very bad, a hopeless case, said Katavarsov. Well, let us drink to his recovery, or let us wish that at least 100th part of his dreams come true. Even that will be such a joy as was never seen on earth. Soon after dinner, the visitors left to get ready for the wedding. When he was alone, Levin, thinking over the remarks of the three bachelors, once more asked himself whether there was in his soul any of that regret for his freedom that they had been speaking about. The question made him smile. Freedom. What is the good of freedom? Happiness consists only in loving and desiring, in wishing her wishes and in thinking her thoughts, which means having no freedom, whatever that is happiness. But do I know her thoughts, wishes, or feelings? A voice suddenly whispered. The smile faded from his face, and he pondered, and all at once a strange sensation came over him. He was possessed by fear and doubt of everything. Supposing she does not love me, supposing she is only marrying me just to get married, supposing she does not herself know what she is doing, he asked himself. She might bethink herself, and only when she is already married find out that she does not and never could love me. And strange and most evil thoughts about her came into his mind. He became jealous of Vronsky, just as he had been the year before, as if it had been but yesterday that he saw her with him, he suspected that she had not told him the whole truth. Suddenly he jumped up. "No, this won't do," he said to himself despairingly. "I will go to her and tell her for the last time that we are now free, and that perhaps we had better keep, so anything would be better than continual shame, misery, infidelity." With his heart full of despair and bitterness toward everyone, toward himself and her, he left the hotel and went to her. He found her in one of the back rooms. She was sitting on a trunk, making some arrangements, with one of the maids sorting a pile of differently colored dresses that hung over the backs of chairs or lay on the floor. "Oh," she cried when she saw him, and her face lit up with joy. "Why have you?" "Well, this is a surprise, and I'm sorting my old dresses to give them away." "Ah, that is very nice," he said gloomily with a glance at the maid. "You may go, Dunyasha. I will call you," said Kitty. "What is the matter with you?" she asked. As soon as the maid was gone, she had noticed his strange expression, at once excited and gloomy, and was seized with alarm. "Kitty, I am in torture. I cannot bear it alone," he cried in a despairing tone, standing before her and looking imploringly into her eyes. Already in her loving, truthful face, he could read that what he was going to tell her would lead to nothing, yet he felt that he still wanted to hear her disavow. "I have come to say that there is still time. All this business can still be put a stop to. What I don't understand in the least. What is the matter with you? What I have said 1,000 times, and cannot help thinking that I am not worthy of you. It cannot be that you have agreed to marry me. Think it over. You have made a mistake. Think it well over. You cannot love me. You'd better tell me," he went on without looking at her. "I shall be unhappy. Of course, let them all say what they like. Anything is better than the misfortune anyhow. It would be better now while there is still time." "I don't understand," she said, thoroughly frightened. "Do you mean you refuse? Why, stop." "Yes, if you don't love me." "Are you mad?" she exclaimed, flushing with vexation. But his face was so piteous that she suppressed her vexation, and throwing the dresses on a chair, sat down closer to him. What are you thinking about? Tell me everything." "I think you cannot love me." "What could you love me for? Oh God, what can I do?" she cried, and began to weep. "Oh, what have I done?" he exclaimed, and kneeling before her, he began kissing her hands. When the princess came in 5 minutes later, she found them quite reconciled. Kitty had not only assured him that she loved him, but had even given him, in answer to his question, the reasons why she told him she loved him. Because she completely understood him, because she knew that it was necessary for him to love, and that all that he loved was good. This seemed quite clear to him. When the princess entered, they were sitting side by side on the trunk, sorting the dresses and disputing, because Kitty wanted to give Dunyasha the brown dress she had worn when Levin proposed to her, while he insisted that that dress should not be given to anyone, and that she should give Dunyasha a blue one instead. "How is it you don't understand? She is dark, and it won't suit her." "I have considered it all." When the princess heard why he had come, she grew angry, half in fun and half in earnest, and told him to go home and dress, and not to delay. Kitty, whose hair had to be done by the hairdresser, due to arrive immediately. She has scarcely eaten anything all these days, and has grown quite plain. "And here you come and upset her with your nonsense," said she. Be off, my dear." Guilty and ashamed, but comforted, Levin returned to his hotel. His brother Dolly and Oblonsky, all in evening dress, were waiting to bless him with the icon. Dolly had to return home to fetch her son, who, his hair oiled and curled, was to drive in the bride's carriage and hold an icon. Then a carriage had to be sent to fetch the groomsmen, and another was to take Sergei Ivanitch and return again. Altogether, there were many complicated arrangements to consider. One thing was certain: there was no time to be lost, for it was already 6:30. The blessing was not a success. Oblonsky, standing in a comically solemn attitude beside his wife, took the icon and told Levin to bow to the ground. Then he blessed him, smiling a kindly amused smile, and kissed him 3 times. Dolly did the same. Then she hurried away and again became confused about the arrangements for the carriages. "Then this is what we must do. You go and fetch him in our carriage, and Sergei Ivanitch, if you will be so kind, will go first, and will send the carriage back. Of course I shall be very pleased, and we will follow immediately with him." "Have your trunks been sent off?" inquired Oblonsky. "Yes, they have," replied Levin, and told Kutsma to get his things out that he might dress. Chapter 3. A crowd of people, mostly women, had assembled outside the church, which was brightly lit up for the wedding. Those who had arrived Too late to get into the middle of the throng pressed round the windows, pushing and disputing, and trying to peer in between the bars. More than 20 carriages had already been arranged along the street by the mounted police. A police officer, unmindful of the frost, stood at the entrance looking brilliant in his blue uniform. More carriages kept driving up, and now ladies with flowers in their hair got out holding up their trains, or men appeared who doffed their military caps or black hats. As they entered the church inside the building, the candles in both chandeliers were already lit, as well as all the candles in front of the icons. The golden glitter on the crimson background of the iconostasis, the gilt ornaments of the icons, the silver of the chandeliers and candlesticks, the flagstones of the floor, the mats, the banners above the choir, the steps of the ambo, the ancient books black with age, the cassocks and surplices were all inundated with light. On the right of the well-heated church, a staid though animated conversation was going on amidst the swallowtail coats, white ties, uniforms, brocades, velvets, and satins, hair, flowers, bare shoulders and arms, and long gloves, the sound of which re-echoed strangely from the high dome above. Every time the door creaked, everyone turned round expecting to see the bride and bridegroom enter, but the door had opened more than 10 times, and each time it turned out to be a guest who had been detained. And now joined the crowd on the right, or a spectator who had managed to deceive or soften the heart of the police officer, and who joined the throng of strangers on the left, and both relatives and spectators had passed through every phase of anticipation. At first, they expected the bride and groom to enter at any moment and attached no importance to the delay. Then they turned more and more often toward the door, wondering whether anything had happened. At length, the delay became awkward, and the friends and relatives tried to look as if they were not thinking about the bride and groom, but were absorbed in their conversations. The archdeacon, as if to draw attention to the value of his time, coughed impatiently, making the windows vibrate. From the choir, growing weary of waiting, came the sound of voices being tried and the blowing of noses. The priest continually sent a chanter or deacon to see whether the bridegroom had arrived, and he himself, in his purple surplice with the embroidered girdle, went with increasing frequency to the side door in expectation of the bridegroom. At last one of the ladies looked at her watch and said, "Well, this is strange," and then all the guests became restless and expressed their surprise and dissatisfaction aloud. The best man went to find out what had occurred. All this while Kitty, long since ready in her white dress, long veil and crown of orange blossoms, stood with an old lady who was to accompany her, and her sister, the Princess Lvova, at a window of the ballroom at the Shabatskys for the last half hour, vainly expecting her best man to come and announce that the bridegroom had reached the church. Levin, meanwhile, in trousers but without coat or waistcoat, was pacing up and down his room, perpetually putting his head out of the door and glancing up the corridor. But in the corridor there was nobody, and in despair he returned and addressed Blonsky, who was quietly smoking. Was ever a man in such a terribly idiotic position? He demanded. "Yes, it is stupid," Oblonsky concurred with a soothing smile. "But don't worry, it'll be here in a minute." "Oh, how can I help it?" said Levin with suppressed fury. "And these idiotic open waistcoats, it's impossible." He glanced at his crumpled shirt front. "And suppose the things have already gone to the station," he exclaimed in despair. "Then you'll have to wear mine. I ought to have done that long ago. It is better not to look ridiculous. Wait, it will all shape itself." The fact of the matter was that when Levin told his old servant Kutzman to get his things ready, Kutzman had duly brought his dress coat, waistcoat, and what else he considered necessary. "But the shirt," Levin exclaimed. "You've got it on," Kutzman replied with a quiet smile. He had not thought of leaving out a clean shirt, and having been told to pack everything and send it to the Sherbakovskys once they were to start that evening, he had done so, and had left out only the dress suit. The shirt Levin had been wearing since the morning was crumpled and quite unfit to wear. With the fashionable low-cut waistcoat, it was too far to send to the Sherbakovskys, so they sent out to buy one. But as it was Sunday, all the shops had closed early. They sent for one of Oblonsky's, but it was much too wide and too short. They were obliged to send to the Shabatskys after all. And the things had to be unpacked. Meantime, in the church, everyone was waiting for the bridegroom, while he was pacing up and down like a caged beast, looking despairingly along the corridor, remembering all he had said to Kitty and wondering what she must be thinking now. At last, the guilty Kutsma, quite out of breath, rushed in with the shirt, only just in time. They were hoisting the trunk into the cart. He gasped 3 minutes later, Levin not looking at the clock to avoid upsetting himself. Still more ran as fast as he could down the corridor. That won't help matters, remarked Oblonsky, smiling and following without haste. It will all shape itself, I assure you. Chapter 4. Here they are there. He is. Which one is it? The younger one. Oh, look at her, poor dear. More dead than alive, people in the crowd were saying. As Levin met his bride at the door and entered the church with her, Oblonsky told his wife the reason of the delay. And the guests smiled and whispered to one another. Levin saw no one and nothing. He did not take his eyes off his bride. Everyone said she had grown plainer during the last few days, and in her bridal dress was nothing like so pretty as usual. But Levin thought otherwise. He looked at her hair dressed high beneath the long veil, and white flowers at the high frill that covered her long neck at the sides and showed it in front in a particularly maidenly way. And at her strikingly slender waist, he thought she was prettier than ever. Not that those flowers, the veil, or the dress ordered from Paris enhanced her beauty in any way, but because despite all the carefully planned richness of her attire, the look on her sweet face and lips was still that look of innocent truthfulness. I thought you meant to run away, she said, smiling at him. It was such a stupid thing that happened. I am ashamed to tell it, he said with a blush, and was obliged to turn round. To the approaching Sergei Ivanitch, nice story. That about your shirt, said Sergei Ivanitch with a smile and shake of the head. Yes, yes, answered Levin, unable to understand what was being said now. Then Gostoshka, said Oblonsky, feigning consternation. You've got to decide an important point, and you're in exactly the right frame of mind to appreciate its importance. I have been asked whether you will have new candles or used ones to hold. The difference is 10 rubles. He added, puckering his lips into a smile. I have settled it. But perhaps you will not be satisfied. Though he knew it was a joke, Levin could not smile well. Then is it to be fresh candles or used ones? That is the question. Yes, yes, fresh ones. Well, I'm very glad that question is settled, said Oblonsky with a smile. How stupid people do become under these circumstances. He went on, turning to Chichikov, when Levin, with an absent-minded glance at him, moved off toward his bride Kitty. Mind you step first upon the mat, said Countess Nordstein, coming up to them. You are a fine fellow, she added, addressing Levin. Aren't you frightened? Asked Kitty's old Aunt Maria Dmitrina. Are you cold? You look pale. Wait a moment, put your head down, said Kitty's sister, Princess Lvova, and raising her plump, beautiful arms, she adjusted the flowers on Kitty's head. Dolly advanced and was about to say something, but could not speak, and began crying and laughing in an unnatural manner. Kitty gazed at everybody with a look as absent-minded as Levin's. Meanwhile, the clergy put on their vestments, and the priest and deacon came forward to the lectern that stood near the entrance doors. The priest turned to Levin and said something that Levin did not hear. Take the bride's hand and lead her, said the best man. For a long time Levin could not be made to understand what he had to do, and they were a long while trying to set him right, just as they were going to give it up, because he would either use the wrong hand or else take her by the wrong one. He at last comprehended that he, with his right hand, without changing his position, must take her by her right hand. When at last he had taken her hand properly, the priest went a few steps in front of them and halted at the lectern. The crowd of friends and relatives, their voices buzzing, and the lady strains rustling, moved after them. Someone stooped down to arrange the bride's veil. The church became so quiet that the drops of wax were heard falling from the candles. The old priest, with his sacerdotal headgear and his locks of gray hair glistening like silver combed back behind his ears, drew his small old hands out from beneath his vestments of heavy silver cloth with a large gold cross on the back, and began turning over some pages on the lectern. Oblonsky stepped up cautiously, whispered something to him, made a sign to Levin, and stepped back again. The priest lit 2 wax candles decorated with flowers and holding them a skewer in his left hand. so that the wax kept slowly dripping, turned to the young couple. It was the same priest who had heard Levin's confession. He looked wearily and sadly at the bride and bridegroom's side, and disengaging his right hand from the vestments, held it up in blessing over the bridegroom, and then over the bride only in his manner when he placed his fingers on Kitty's bowed head. There was a shade of tenderness. Then he gave them the candles, took the censer, and slowly stepped away from them. Is it really true, thought Levin, and glanced round at his bride. He could see her profile slightly from above, and by the just perceptible movements of her lips and eyelashes, he knew she was aware of his look. She did not turn, but her high-frilled collar moved, rising to her pink little ear. He saw that a sigh had been suppressed within her breast, and that the little hand in its long glove holding the candle trembled. All the worry about his shirt, his lateness, the conversation of their relatives, their displeasure at his ridiculous mishap suddenly vanished from his mind, and he felt happy, though scared. The handsome tall senior deacon, in a silver cloth, Alba's curled hair parted down the middle, came briskly forward, lifting his stole with a practiced movement of 2 fingers, and stopped up as if the priest, "Bless us, Lord." Slowly succeeding one another, and vibrantly resonant came the solemn tones, "Blessed be our God now and hereafter forever and ever," replied the old priest meekly, in a sing-song voice, continuing to turn something over on the lectern. Then harmoniously, filling the whole church from windows to vaulted roof, a full chord sung by the invisible choir rose, swelled, hung for a moment, and softly died away. There were prayers as usual for the world above, for salvation, for the synod, for the emperor, and also for the servants of God. That day wedded Constantine and Catherine. Let us pray to the Lord that he may send them perfect love, peace, and help. The whole church seemed to breathe with the senior deacon's voice. Levin listened to the words and was struck by them. How did they find out that it is help, exactly help, that I need? He wondered, remembering his late fears and doubts. What do I know? What can I do in this awful matter without help? Help is exactly what I need now. When the deacon had finished the prayer for the imperial family, the priest, holding a book, turned to the bride and groom. Eternal God, who joinest them that were separate, he read in his mild sing-song voice, and hast ordained for them an indissoluble union in love. Thou who didst bless Isaac and Rebekah, and hast kept thy promise to their heirs, bless these thy servants Constantine and Catherine, and lead them on the path of righteousness, most merciful God, lover of man. We praise thee. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Ghost, now and hereafter and forever and ever. Amen. From the invisible choir again floated through the air, join us them that were separate. What a depth of meaning is in those words, and how well they fit in with what I am feeling at this moment, thought Levin. Does she feel the same? Looking round, he met her eyes. From the expression in them, he concluded that she understood them as he did, but this was not so. She understood hardly anything of the service, and was not even listening to the words of the ceremony. She could neither listen nor understand, so deep was the one feeling that filled her soul, and became ever stronger and stronger. It was a feeling of joy at the fruition of what had been for the last month and a half going on in her soul, of that which for those 6 weeks had gladdened and tortured her. On the day when, in the ballroom of the house in Arbet Street, she in her brown dress had gone up to him and silently plied herself to him on that day, and in that hour a complete rupture seemed to have taken place within her soul, between her former life and this other new and entirely unknown life, although in fact the old life still went on. Those 6 weeks had been the most blissful, and at the same time the most trying of her life. The whole of her life, all her desires and hopes were concentrated on this one man, still incomprehensible to her, to whom she was bound by a feeling even more incomprehensible than the man himself, which now attracted and now repelled her. Meantime, she went on living under the conditions of her old life, and was horrified at herself, at her utter and unconquerable indifference to all her past, the things, habits, and people who had loved and still loved her, to her mother who was hurt by her indifference, to her dear affectionate father whom she had previously loved more than anyone else on earth. At one moment she was horrified at this indifference, and the next moment rejoiced at that which caused her indifference. She could not think of or desire anything but life with this man, but as that life had not yet begun, she could not even clearly picture it to herself. There was only anticipation, fear, and joy at something new and unknown, and now at any moment the anticipation and uncertainty, and the remorse at repudiating her former life would all come to an end, and something new would begin. This new life could not help being terrible in consequence of its incertitude. But terrible or not, it was already an accomplished fact within her soul 6 weeks ago, and was now only being sanctified again. Turning to the reading desk, the priest with some difficulty picked up Kitty's little ring, and asking leave for his hand, put the ring on the tip of his finger. The servant of God, Constantine, is betrothed to the servant of God, Catherine, and having put a big ring on Kitty's slender rosy finger, pathetic in its weakness, the priest repeated the same words several times. The couple tried to guess what was expected of them and blundered each time, the priest prompting them in whispers. When what was necessary had at length been complied with, he made the sign of the cross over them with the rings, and again gave the larger one to Kitty and the little one to Levin, and again they blundered and passed the rings twice, backwards and forwards, without doing what was necessary. Dolly Cherryhoff and Oblonsky came forward to help them. The result was some confusion, whispering, and smiles. But the expression of solemn emotion on the young couple's faces did not change. On the contrary, while they fumbled with their hands, they looked even more solemn and serious than before. And the smile with which Oblonsky whispered to them to put on their rings involuntarily died on his lips. He felt that any kind of smile would hurt their feelings. Thou hast from the beginning created them male and female. Read the priest, when they had exchanged rings, through thee the wife is knit to the husband for a helpmeet, and to procreate the human race. Therefore, O God our Lord, who sent us down thy truth upon thy heritage, and gave us thy promises to our fathers from generation to generation of thy chosen people, look down upon thy servant Constantine and thy servant Catherine, and strengthen them in their union with faith and concord in truth and love. Levin felt more and more that his ideas of marriage and his dreams of how he would arrange his life had been but childishness, and that this was something he had never understood, and was now still further from understanding, although it was happening to him. And in his breast a tremor rose higher and higher, and the unruly tears came to his eyes. Chapter 5. All Moscow, including both relatives and friends, had congregated in the church during the marriage ceremony in the brilliantly illuminated building. Among the crowd of elegantly dressed women and girls, and men in evening dress with white ties or in uniform, conversation in the low tones required by propriety never flagged. It was usually started by the men, for the women were absorbed in watching every detail of the service, which always fascinates them. In the circle nearest the bride were her two sisters, Dolly the elder, and the calm and beautiful Princess Luova, who had come from abroad. Why is Marie in lilac? It's almost as unsuitable at a wedding as black, remarked Mrs. Korsunskaya with her complexion. It's her only salvation, replied Princess Druitskaya. I wonder they are having the wedding in the evening. Like tradespeople, it is more showy. I was married in the evening, too, answered Mrs. Korsunskaya, and sighed as she remembered how sweet she had looked that day, how funnily enamored her husband then was, and how different things were now. They say that one who has been best man more than 10 times never marries, and I wanted to be one for the 10th time, to make myself safe. But was too late. Count Signavine was saying to the pretty young Princess Charskaya, who had designs on him. She answered only with a smile. She was looking at Kitty and thinking of the time when she would be standing there beside Count Sinovin, just as Kitty now stood, and how she would then remind him of his joke. Young Sherbatsky told the old maid of honor, Nikolaeva, that he intended to put the crown on Kitty Shinoy to make her happy. One ought not to wear chenille, replied the maid of honor, who had long ago made up her mind that if the old widower for whom she was angling ever married her, their wedding should be of the simplest. Kosnichev was talking to Dolly, jokingly assuring her that the custom of going away after the wedding was spreading, because newly married couples always felt rather uncomfortable. Your brother has a right to feel proud. She is wonderfully sweet. You must be feeling envious. I am past all that, Daria Alexandrovna, he answered, and his face became unexpectedly sad and serious. Oblonsky was telling his sister-in-law the pun he had made about dissolving marriages. I must put her wreath straight, she replied, without listening. What a pity she has grown so much plainer, remarked Countess Nordstern to the Princess Lvova all the same. He is not worth her little finger. Don't you agree? No, I like him very much, and not just because he will be my brother-in-law, answered the princess. How well he behaves, and it is so difficult to behave well under these circumstances, and not be ridiculous, and he is not ridiculous, or stiff, and is evidently touched. I suppose you quite expected this. Almost she always liked him. Well, let us see which of them will step first on the mat. I have given Kitty my advice. It does not matter, replied Princess Lvova. We are all submissive wives. It is in our nature. Well, I stepped on the mat before Vasily, and you, Dolly, who was standing near, heard, but did not reply. Her eyes were moist, and she could not have spoken. Without bursting into tears, she rejoiced at the sight of Kitty and Laving. But going back to the past, she thought of her own wedding, kept glancing at the beaming Oblonsky, and forgetting the present recollected nothing but her own young and innocent love. She remembered not herself only, but all the women with whom she was intimate or acquainted, thought of them as they had been at that most solemn moment of their lives when, like Kitty, they had stood beneath the nuptial crown, with love, hope, and fear in their hearts, renouncing the past and entering upon the mystic future. Among the brides that came to her mind was her dear Anna, about whose impending divorce she had heard a while ago. She had once stood with veiled head pure and crowned with orange blossom, and now... How strange, she murmured. All the details of the ceremony were followed not only by the two sisters, the friends and relatives, but also by women onlookers who were quite strangers, and who, breathless with excitement and afraid of missing anything, even a single movement or expression of the bride's or bridegroom's face, and annoyed by the indifference of the men, did not answer, and indeed often did not hear the latter when they jested or made irrelevant remarks. Why is her face so tear-stained? Is she being married against her will? Against her will, indeed, to such a fine fellow? Is he a prince? And is that her sister in white satin? Now hear how the deacon will roar, wives, obey your husbands. Is it the Tchaikovsky choir? No, the synods. I asked the footman. It seems he will take her to his estate straight off. He's dreadfully rich, they say. That's why they have given her to him. Oh no, they are a very nice couple there. Now, Maria Vasilyevna, you were maintaining that crinolines were being worn. Fooler at the back, just look at that one in the pewter dress, an ambassador's wife. They say, see how it's draped this way and back again. What a darling! The bride is like a lamb decked for the slaughter. But whatever you may say, one does feel sorry for a girl. So chattered the crowd of women who had managed to get inside the church. Chapter 6. When the first part of the ceremony was over, a verger spread out a piece of pink silk cloth in front of the lectern. The choir began singing a psalm to some elaborate and complicated melody in which the bass and tenor continually repeated each other, and the priest, turning round, motioned the couple to the piece of pink silk. Often as they had heard the saying that the one who stepped first on the mat would be head of the household, neither Levin nor Kitty could think of that as they took those few steps, nor did they hear the loud remarks and disputes of those who maintained that he was first, and of others who said that they did it both together, after the usual questions of whether they wished to be married and whether they had promised themselves to others, and their answers, which sounded strange to themselves. The second part of the service began. Kitty listened to the words of the prayer, trying to comprehend their meaning, but unable to do so. Triumphant, radiant joy filled her heart more and more as the ceremony proceeded, and made it impossible for her to be attentive. They prayed that they may live in chastity for the good of the fruits of the womb, and find joy in their sons and daughters. It was declared that God had created woman from Adam's rib, and that for this cause shall a man leave his father and mother, and cleave unto his wife, and they twain shall be one flesh, and that this is a great mystery. They prayed that God should make them fruitful and bless them as he blessed Isaac and Rebekah, Joseph, Moses, and Zipporah, and that they should see their children's children. It is all very beautiful, thought Kitty as she heard these words, and could not be different, and a smile of joy which involuntarily communicated itself to all who regarded her shone on her radiant face. Put it quite on. Came the words of advice when the priest had put crowns on their heads, and Sherbatsky, his hand in its three-button glove trembling, held the crown high above Kitty's head. Put it on, she whispered, smiling. Levin glanced round at her, was struck by the joyous radiance of her face, and was involuntarily infected by her feeling. He felt bright and joyous as she did. With light hearts, they heard the epistle read, and the roll of the senior deacon's voice. In the last verse, for which the outsiders present had been waiting impatiently, with light hearts, they drank the warm wine and water from the shallow cup, and their spirits rose still higher when the priest, throwing back his vestments, took their hands in his and led them round the lectern, while a bass voice sang Rejoice, O Isaiah. Young Sherbatsky and Shirikov, who was supporting the crowns and getting entangled in the bride's train, smiled too and were pleased without knowing why when they chanced to lag behind or jostle the young couple if the priest happened to stop. The spark of joy that was glowing in Kitty's heart seemed to have spread to everyone in the church. Leavening fancied that the priest and deacon wanted to smile, just as he did. Having lifted the crowns from their heads, the priest read the last prayer and congratulated the married couple. Levin glanced at Kitty and thought he had never seen her like that before, so enchanting with the new light of happiness irradiating her face. He wished to speak to her, but did not know whether it was all over yet. The priest helped him out of the difficulty, saying softly, with a smile on his kindly mouth, "Kiss your wife and you kiss your husband." He took the candles from their hands. Levin kissed her carefully on her smiling lips, offered his arm, and with a feeling of strange closeness led her out of the church. He could not believe it was all true, and only realized it when their surprised and timid glances met, and he felt that they were already one. After supper that same night, the young couple left for the country. Chapter 7. Vronsky and Anna had already been traveling together in Europe. For 3 months they had visited Venice, Rome, and Naples, and had only just reached a small Italian town where they meant to make a longer stay. A handsome headwaiter, his thick hair greased with pomatum and parted from the nape upward, dressed in a swallowtail coat with a wide lawn shirt front and a bundle of charms dangling on his rotund stomach, with his hands in his pockets, his eyes screwed up contemptuously, was answering a bystander's questions in a severe tone. Hearing steps ascending the stairs at the other side of the entrance, the waiter turned and recognized the Russian count, who occupied the best rooms in the hotel. He respectfully took his hands out of his pockets, bowed, and said that the courier had been, and that the business of renting the palazzo was settled. The steward was ready to sign the contract. "I am very glad," said Vronsky, "and as the lady has been for a walk, but has now returned," replied the waiter. Vronsky took off his soft, broad-brimmed hat and wiped his perspiring forehead and his hair, which he had allowed to grow halfway down his ears and wore brushed back so as to hide his bald patch. After an absent-minded glance at the man who was still standing there watching him, he was about to go. "And this gentleman is a Russian and was asking about you," said the head waiter with a mixture of vexation at the impossibility of evading his acquaintances anywhere and of desire to find something to distract the monotony of his life. Vronsky looked round again at the man who had first moved away and then halted, and at the same moment the eyes of both brightened. Golenichev. Vronsky. It was really Golenichev, his fellow student in the cordage in the corps. Golenichev had been a liberal, had left the corps a civilian, and had never served. On leaving the corps, the two friends had separated and had met but once since then. On that occasion, Vronsky found that Golenichev had chosen some high-flown liberal activity, and therefore felt he must despise Vronsky's profession and activities. Consequently, Vronsky had then treated him with the cold, proud aloofness of which he was master, which meant, "You may like or dislike my way of life. It is a matter of absolute indifference to me. But if you wish to know me, you must respect me." And Golenichev remained contemptuously indifferent to Vronsky's attitude, so that meeting ought to have separated them still further. Yet now they brightened up and exclaimed with pleasure at recognizing one another. Vronsky would never have thought he could be so pleased to see Golenichev, but probably he was himself unaware how bored he was. He forgot the unpleasant impression left by their last encounter, and with an open and joyful countenance held out his hand to his old schoolfellow. A similar expression of pleasure replaced the former anxious look on Golenichev's face. "How pleased I am to see you," said Vronsky, a friendly smile disclosing his fine white teeth. "I heard the name of Vronsky But I did not know which Vronsky. I am very, very pleased. Come in well. And what are you doing? Oh, I have been here over a year. I am working, said Vronsky in an interested tone. Well, come in. And according to the usual way with Russians, instead of saying what he wanted to hide from the servants in Russian, he began speaking French. You know, Madame Karenina, we are traveling together. I am now going to her, he said in French, attentively watching Golanishev's expression. I did not know. Golanishev replied in a tone of indifference, though he was quite aware of it. Been here long, he added. 3 days, answered Vronsky, still attentively scrutinizing his friend's face. Yes, he is a decent fellow, and looks at the matter in the right way, said Vronsky himself, understanding the meaning of the other's look. And the change of subject, I can introduce him to Anna, as he sees the matter rightly. During the 3 months he had spent abroad with Anna, Vronsky, when coming across new people, had always asked himself how the new person would be likely to regard his relations with Anna, and in most cases he had found that the men he met understood it in the right way. But had he and those who understood the matter in the right way been asked what this understanding amounted to, they would have been much puzzled how to reply. At bottom, those who in Vronsky's opinion understood it the right way did not understand it in any special way, but behaved in general as well-bred persons do with regard to all the complicated and unanswerable problems which surround life on every side. They conducted themselves properly, avoiding insinuations and inconvenient questions. They pretended to understand completely the significance and meaning of the situation, to countenance and even approve of it, but to consider it out of place and unnecessary to explain all this. Vronsky at once guessed that Galanishev was one of that sort, and therefore doubly pleased to have met him. And Galanishev behaved to Anna when he had been introduced as well as Vronsky could have wished. Evidently he avoided without the least effort everything in conversation that might have sounded awkward. He had never met Anna before, and was struck by her beauty and still more by the simplicity with which she accepted her position. She blushed when Vronsky showed Galanishev in, and the childlike flush that suffused her open and handsome face pleased him exceedingly. But what pleased him most was that at once, and apparently intentionally, to prevent any possibility of misapprehension in the stranger's mind, she called Vronsky simply Alexei, and said that they were about to move into a house of their own called a palazzo, which they had just taken. This straightforward and simple attitude toward her own position pleased Galanishev. Noticing Anna's good-natured, bright, and energetic manner, he thought that, knowing both Karenin and Vronsky as he did, he quite understood her. He thought he understood what she herself was quite unable to understand, how though she was the cause of her husband's unhappiness, and had abandoned him and her son and lost her own good name, she could feel energetic, cheerful, and happy. It is mentioned in the guidebook, said Galanishev, referring to the palazzo Vronsky was taking there, is a fine Tintoretto there, one of his later period. I say the weather is glorious, let us go and have another look at it, said Vronsky. To Anna, I should like to very much. I'll just go and put on my hat. You say it's hot, she asked, stopping at the door and looking inquiringly at Vronsky, while a bright flush again suffused her face. From her look, Vronsky understood that she did not yet know what attitude he wished to adopt towards Galanishev, and was afraid she might not have behaved suitably. He answered with a long and tender look, no, not very hot, he said. She thought she had understood him completely, and above all that he was satisfied with her. She gave him a smile and went out with rapid steps. The two friends looked at each other, and in both faces appeared an embarrassed expression, as if Galanishev, who obviously admired her, tried but failed to hit on the right thing to say about her, and as if Vronsky both feared and wished that he should succeed well. And so you've settled down here, said Vronsky, in order to begin a conversation. You are still busy at the same thing, he went on, recollecting that he had heard the other was writing something. Yes, I am writing the second part of To Principles, said Galanishev, flushing with pleasure at the question. To be quite exact, I mean, I'm not yet writing, but I'm collecting the materials. The book will be much fuller and will deal with almost all the questions. We in Russia are slow to realize that we are the inheritors of Byzantium, and he began a long and heated explanation. At first Vronsky felt uncomfortable, because he did not know even the first part of To Principles, which the author mentioned as if it were well known. But later on, when Galenichev began expounding his view and Vronsky was able to follow him, even though he was ignorant of To Principles, he listened with interest, for the man talked well, yet Vronsky was surprised at and sorry to see the irritable excitement with which Galenichev spoke on the subject that interested him. The longer he talked, the more his eyes flashed, the more hastily he retorted on imaginary opponents, and the more agitated and offended became his face, remembering him as a thin, active, good-natured, and noble boy, always at the head of his class. Vronsky could not understand the cause of the agitation, nor approve of it. What most displeased him was that Galenichev, a man belonging to good society, should put himself on the same level with certain scribblers who irritated him and made him angry. Was it worthwhile? He did not like this, but nevertheless he felt that Galenichev was not happy, and he was sorry for him. Signs of distress, of insanity, almost were apparent in his mobile and rather good-natured face when, without even observing that Anna had re-entered the room, he continued expressing his views with haste and warmth when Anna returned with her hat and mantle on and stood beside him, toying with her sunshade with quick motions of her beautiful hand. Vronsky, with a feeling of relief, turned from Galenichev's eyes, which were fixed on him plaintively. With renewed love he glanced at his charming companion, so full of vitality and joy. With an effort Galenichev recollected himself, but he was at first dejected and morose. Anna, however, who at that time was amiably disposed to everyone, soon revived him by her simple and cheerful behavior. After trying several topics of conversation, she led him on to the subject of art, about which he talked very well and listened to him with attention. They walked to the house they had taken and looked over it. "I am very pleased about one thing," said Anna to Galenichev when they had returned to the hotel. "Alexei will have a nice studio. You must certainly have that room, Alexei," she added, having understood that Galenichev was to be on an intimate footing with them, and that there was no need to pretend in his presence. "Do you paint?" inquired Galenichev, turning quickly to Vronsky. "Yes, I went in for it long ago, and now have begun a little," answered Vronsky with a blush. "He is very talented," said Anna, with a pleased smile. "Of course, I am no judge, but people who do know say so." Chapter 8. During this, the first period of her freedom and rapid recovery, Anna was unpardonably happy and full of the joy of life. The memory of her husband's grief did not poison her happiness. On the one hand, this memory was too terrible to dwell upon, and on the other hand, her husband's misfortune had meant for her too great a joy for repentance to be possible. The recollection of all that had happened to her since her illness, her reconciliation with her husband, the rupture, the news of Vronsky's wound, his reappearance in her husband's house, the preparations for divorce, the parting from her home and son, all now seemed a delirious dream from which she had wakened abroad and alone with Vronsky. The memory of the evil done to her husband aroused in her a feeling akin to repulsion, such as a man might feel who, when in danger of drowning, had shaken off another who clung to him. That other was drowned. Of course, it was wrong, but it had been the only way of escape, and it was better not to recall such terrible details. One comforting reflection about her conduct had come to her in the first moment of the rupture, and when she now remembered the past, she also recalled that reflection. "I was the inevitable cause of unhappiness to him," she thought, "but I don't wish to profit by his calamity. I am suffering and must suffer. I am losing what I most cherished, my good name, and my son. I have done wrong, and therefore do not ask for happiness and do not want a divorce. I must go on suffering from the degradation and by the separation from my son." But sincerely as Anna desired to suffer, she was not suffering. She was not conscious of degradation with the tact they both possessed, and by avoiding Russian ladies abroad, the two never placed themselves in a false position and always met people who pretended to understand their mutual relations much better than they themselves understood them. The parting from her son, whom she loved, did not trouble her at first either. The little girl, his child, was so sweet, and Anna had grown so attached to her, since she was the only child left to her, that she rarely thought of her son. The desire to live, enhanced by her recovery, was so powerful, and the conditions of her life were so novel and pleasant, that Anna felt unpardonably happy. The better she knew Vronsky, the more she loved him. both for his own sake and for his love of her to possess him entirely, was a continual joy to her. His nearness was always pleasant. All the traits of character with which she became better and better acquainted seemed inexpressibly delightful. His appearance, altered by civilian dress, was as attractive to her as to a girl in love. In all he said, thought, or did she saw something peculiarly noble and exalted. She herself was frightened at the rapture with which he inspired her. She saw it but could not find anything in him that was not beautiful. She dared not let him see her consciousness of her own inferiority to her. It seemed that if he knew of it he would the sooner cease to love her, and there was nothing she now feared more, though she had no reason to do so, than the loss of his love. But she could not help being grateful to him for his treatment of her, and showing him how much she valued it. He who, in her opinion, had such a decided vocation for statesmanship, in which he ought to have played a conspicuous part, had sacrificed his ambitions for her, and never showed the least regret. He was even more lovingly respectful to her than before, and the thought that she must never be allowed to feel the awkwardness of her situation never left his mind for a moment. He, so virile a man, not only never contradicted her, but where she was concerned seemed to have no will of his own, and to be only occupied in anticipating her every wish. She could not help appreciating this. Although his strained attentiveness, the atmosphere of solicitude with which he surrounded her, became burdensome at times. Ronxy, meanwhile, in spite of the complete fulfillment of what he had so long desired, was not completely happy. He soon felt that the realization of his longing gave him only one grain of the mountain of bliss he had anticipated. That realization showed him the eternal error men make by imagining that happiness consists in the gratification of their wishes. When first he united his life with hers and donned civilian clothes, he felt the delight of freedom in general, such as he had not before known, and also the freedom of love. He was contented then, but not for long. Soon he felt rising in his soul a desire for desire's boredom. Involuntarily, he began to snatch at every passing caprice, mistaking it for a desire and a purpose. 16 hours daily had to be filled somehow living abroad, as they did, completely at liberty, quite cut off from the round of social life that had filled his time in Petersburg. The pleasures of a bachelor's life enjoyed by him on his previous travels abroad were not to be thought of now, for one attempt of that kind had produced an unexpected fit of depression quite disproportionate to the offense of a late supper with some acquaintances. Intercourse with local society, or with the Russians, was, in consequence of the indefiniteness of their relation, likewise impossible. Sightseeing, apart from the fact that he had already seen everything, had for him a Russian and an intelligent man none of that inexplicable importance the English managed to attach to it, as a hungry animal seizes every object it meets, hoping to find food in it. Vronsky unconsciously seized now on politics, now on new books, now on pictures. As in his youth he had shown aptitude for art, and not knowing how to spend his money, had begun to collect engravings, he now settled down to painting, and began to work at putting into it the surplus stock of desire which demanded satisfaction. He had a talent for understanding art and for imitating it with accuracy and good taste, and he imagined that he possessed the real power an artist needs. After wavering for some time between various kinds of art, religious, historical, genre, or realistic, he began to paint. He understood all the different kinds and was able to draw inspiration from all. But he could not imagine that it is possible to be quite ignorant of the different kinds of art and to be inspired directly by what is in one's own soul, regardless of whether what one paints belongs to any particular school. As he did not know this, and was not inspired directly by life, but indirectly by life already embodied in art, he found inspiration very readily and easily, and equally readily and easily produced paintings very similar to the school of art he wished to imitate. He liked the graceful and effective French school of painting best, and in that style began painting a portrait of Anna dressed as an Italian, and he, as well as everyone else who saw it, considered the portrait a great success. Chapter 9. The neglected old palazzo, with its high stucco ceilings, its wall frescoes and mosaic floors, with heavy yellow damask hangings at the big windows, vases standing on brackets, and mantel shelves, carved doors, and somber halls filled with pictures. That palazzo when they had moved into it by its very appearance kept alive in Vronsky the pleasant delusion that he was not so much a Russian landowner and equerry without a post as an enlightened connoisseur and art patron, and with all a modest artist himself who had renounced the world his connections and ambitions. For the sake of the woman he loved, the role Vronsky had chosen with their removal to the Palazzo was quite successful, and having through Golishev made the acquaintance of several interesting persons, he felt tranquil. For a time he painted studies from nature under the direction of an Italian professor and studied Italian life in the Middle Ages. Medieval Italian life had at that time become so fascinating to him that he even began to wear his hat and throw his cloak across his shoulder in a medieval manner, which was very becoming to him. "Here we live and know nothing," said Vronsky one morning to Golinchev, who had come to see him. "Have you seen Mikhailov's picture?" And he passed his visitor a Russian newspaper that had just arrived and pointed to an article on a Russian artist who was living in that town and had just finished a picture long talked of and bought before completion. The article reproached the government and the academy for leaving a remarkable artist without encouragement or help. "I have answered Golinchev, of course, he is not without talent, but his tendency is quite a false one. He has that Ivanov Stravinsky attitude toward Christ and religious art." "What is the subject of his picture?" asked Anna. "Christ before Pilate. Christ is pictured as a Jew with all the realism of the new school." Led on by this question about the subject of the picture to one of his favorite topics, he began to explain, "I can't understand how one can make so gross an error in the art of the old masters. Christ was given a definite embodiment. Therefore, if they want to depict not God, but a revolutionary or a sage, let them choose some historic character, Socrates, Franklin, Charlotte Corday, but certainly not Christ. They choose the one person who must not be chosen as a subject for art. And then, and is it true that this Mikhailov is so poor?" inquired Vronsky, thinking that he, as a Russian mightness, ought to help this artist regardless of whether his picture was good or bad. "Hardly. He's a wonderful portrait painter. Have you seen his portrait of Vasilchikova? But it seems he does not want to paint any more portraits. So it is possible he may be in want." "I say that, couldn't one ask him to paint Anna Arkadyevna's portrait?" said Vronsky. "Why mine?" said Anna. "After the one you painted I want no other. I better have one of Annie, as she called her little girl. Oh, there she is," she added, looking from the window at the beautiful Italian nurse who had taken the baby into the garden, and then immediately glancing round at Vronsky. The beautiful nurse, whose head Vronsky was painting for his picture, was the only and secret sorrow of Anna's life. Vronsky painted her, admired her beauty and her meanness, and Anna dared not confess to herself that she was afraid of being jealous of the nurse, so she treated the woman with special kindness and spoiled her and her little son Vronsky to look out of the window and into Anna's eyes, and at once turned to Golishev, saying, "Do you know this Mikhailov? I have met him, but he is a crank and quite uneducated. You know, he is one of those heathenish new folk one so often meets nowadays. You know, one of those free thinkers who have been brought up from the beginning in disbelief, negation, and materialism." Formerly, Golinchev went on, either not noticing or not wishing to notice that both Anna and Vronsky wanted to speak. Formerly, a free thinker was a man brought up with ideas of religion, law, and morality, who himself through struggle and pain had attained freedom of thought. But now a new type of born free thinkers has appeared. These grow up without so much as hearing that there used to be laws of morality and religion, and that there was once authority in these things. They grow up simply with the idea of negation, that is, as heathens. He is one of these. He is the son of a head footman, I think, and has had no education when he entered the academy, and won a reputation for himself. He, not being stupid, wanted to get some education, so he resorted to what seemed to him to be the wellspring of education, the magazines. You see, formerly a man who wished to get an education, or a Frenchman, let us say, would have commenced studying all the classics, theologians, dramatists, historians, and philosophers, and with what mental labor he would have been confronted. But among us at the present day, he tumbled straight into the literature of negation and rapidly assimilated the essence of the negative teaching. And there he was, and that is not all 20 years ago. He would have found in that kind of literature signs of the struggle with authority and of an outlook centuries old, and from that struggle would have deduced that something else had existed. But as it is, he stumbles on a kind of literature that does not even deign to dispute the old point of view, saying straight off there is nothing but evolution, selection, the struggle for existence, and nothing more. In my article, "Do you know what will do?" cried Anna, who for some time had been furtively exchanging looks with Vronsky, and knew that the latter was not at all interested in the education of the artist, but was only concerned to help him by giving him a commission for a portrait. "Do you know what will do?" she resolutely interrupted Golinchev, who was in the full flow of his speech. "Let us go and see him." Golinez pulled himself up and unwillingly agreed. But as the artist lived in a distant part of the town, they decided to hire a carriage. An hour later, Anna, seated beside Golinez, with Vronsky facing them, drove to a new ugly house in a distant quarter of the town, having learned from the house porter's wife, who came out to meet them, that Mikhailov allowed visitors into his studio. But was at that moment at his lodgings a few steps away. They sent her, with their cards, to beg permission to see his pictures. Chapter 10. Mikhailov, the artist, was at work as usual when Vronsky's and Golanishev's cards were brought him. Every morning he worked in the studio at his big picture. On returning home, he had been angry with his wife because she had not managed to pacify the landlady, who clamored for the rent. "Have I not told you scores of times not to enter upon discussions? At best you're only a fool, and when you begin arguing in Italian, you become a triple fool," he said at the end of a long dispute. "Then you shouldn't get into arrears. It's not my fault if I had any money." "Shut up, for heaven's sake," cried Mikhailov with tears in his voice, stopping his ears with his hands as he went into his workroom behind a partition and locked the door behind him. "What a duffer," he muttered to himself as he seated himself at the table, and having opened a portfolio he at once set to work with particular ardor at an unfinished drawing. He never worked with such ardor or so successfully as when things were going badly with him, and especially after a quarrel with his wife. "Oh dear, if only I could escape somewhere," he thought. As he worked, he was sketching the figure of a man. In a fit of anger he had sketched him before, but had been dissatisfied with the result. No, the other one was better. "Where is it?" He went back to his wife, and frowning without looking at her, asked his eldest little girl where the paper was. That he had given them the paper with the drawing that he had thrown away was found, but it was dirty now and spotted with candle grease. Nevertheless, he took it, put it on his table, and stepping backward and screwing up his eyes, began examining it. Suddenly he smiled and flung up his arms joyfully. That's it," he said, and taking up his pencil he began drawing rapidly. A grease spot had given the figure a new pose. He copied that new pose, and suddenly remembering the energetic pose and prominent chin of a shopman from whom he had bought cigars, he gave the figure that man's face and chin. He laughed with joy, for the inanimate, unnatural figure had become alive, and was just the thing. The figure was alive, clear, and well defined. It was possible to correct the drawing to accord with the requirements of the pose. It was possible and even necessary to place the feet further apart, to alter the position of the left arm, and to throw back the hair. But while making these corrections, he did not alter the pose, but only removed what interfered with its character. He removed, if one may say so, the coverings which partially obscured the figure, every fresh stroke making its energy and power more apparent, and more as it had been suddenly revealed to him. By the effects of the grease spot he was carefully finishing the drawing when the cards were brought to him. Directly he went out to his wife. "Come, Sasha, don't be angry," he said, smiling timidly and tenderly. "You were wrong, and so was I. I'll settle it all." Having made it up with his wife, he put on an olive green overcoat with a velvet collar and a hat and went to the studio. His successful drawing was already forgotten now. He was pleased and excited by the visit to his studio. These grand Russians, who had come in a carriage about his picture, the one at present on the easel. He had at the bottom of his heart a firm opinion that no one had ever painted anything like it. He did not consider his picture better than all Raphael's, but he knew that what he wanted to express in that picture had never yet been expressed by anyone. Of that he was firmly convinced, and had long been so ever since he had begun painting it. He had the opinion of others, whoever they might be, seemed to him of great importance and disturbed him to the depths of his soul. Every remark, even the most trivial, which showed that those who judged it saw even but a small part of what he himself saw in it, moved him deeply. He always attributed to those judges a better understanding than his own, and always expected to hear from them something he had himself not noticed in his work, often fancying that in their criticisms he had really found that something. With rapid steps he approached the door of his studio, and in spite of his excitement, was struck by the soft light on Anna's figure as she stood in the shadow of the porch listening to something Galactic was vehemently saying, and at the same time evidently wishing to look at the approaching artist. He was himself unconscious that as he approached them he seized and absorbed this impression, just as he had retained the tobacconist's chin and hidden it away where he could find it when it was wanted. The visitors, already disenchanted by Golnichev's account of the artist, were still further disillusioned by his appearance of medium height, thick-set, and with a loose gait. Mikhailov in his brown hat, olive green overcoat, and narrow trousers at a time when wide ones had long since come into fashion, and especially his commonplace broad face, expressing a combination of timidity and a desire to be dignified, created an unpleasant impression. "Come in, please," he said, trying to put on an air of indifference as he entered the hall, and took a key from his pocket to unlock the door. Chapter 11. On entering his studio, the artist again cast a glance at his visitors and took note of Vronsky's face, especially his jaw, although his artistic perceptions never slept, and although he was growing more and more excited as the moment approached when his picture was to be criticized, he quickly and shrewdly, from perceptible data, formed his opinion of these three persons of Galactic. He thought that one is a Russian who lives here. Mikhailov did not remember his name or where he had seen him or what they had talked about. He remembered only his face, as he remembered every face he had ever seen. But he also remembered that it was one of the faces he had mentally put aside with the enormous class of falsely important faces lacking expression. A mass of hair and a very open forehead gave a superficial significance to that face, which had an insignificant, childish, restless expression concentrated in the narrow bridge of the nose. Vronsky and Anna, according to Mikhailov's conception, were in all probability distinguished wealthy Russians, who, like all these wealthy Russians, comprehended nothing of art, but pretended to be amateurs and critics. Probably they've seen all the antiquities and are now going the round of the modern painters, the German quack and the stupid English pre-Raphaelite, and to complete the series have come to see me, he thought. Well, he knew the dilettante's way of examining the studios of modern artists. The cleverer they were, the worse they were, with the one purpose of being able to say afterwards that art had deteriorated, and that the more modern art one sees, the more evident it becomes that the old masters were inimitable. He expected all this, saw it in their faces, in the careless indifference with which they talked among themselves, looked at the lay figures and busts, and unconcernedly walked about, while waiting for him to uncover his picture. But in spite of all this, as he turned over his studies, pulled up the blinds, and withdrew the sheet from his picture, he felt very excited, all the more so because though he regarded distinguished and wealthy Russians as mostly beasts and fools, Vronsky, and especially Anna, pleased him. "Yeah," he said, stepping aside with his loose gait and pointing to the picture. "This is Pilate's admonition." Matthew chapter 27. He went on, conscious that his lips were beginning to tremble with excitement, and he stepped behind the visitors during the few moments that they were silently gazing at it. Mikhailov also regarded it with the indifferent eye of a stranger. In those few moments he believed in advance that the highest and justest of criticisms was going to be pronounced by these very visitors, whom he had so despised. A moment before he forgot all that he had thought of his picture during the 3 years that he had worked at it, forgot all its merits, which he had not doubted, and saw it from the fresh point of view of an indifferent stranger. And he saw nothing good in it. He saw in the foreground Pilate's vexed face and Christ's calm one, and behind them the faces of Pilate's servants and of John watching what was taking place. Each of those faces, that with so much searching, so many faults and corrections he had evolved with its own character, each representing so much pain and pleasure, and all of them so often placed and replaced to obtain harmony, all the shades of color and tone elaborated with such effort all this regarded as a whole from those others' point of view now seemed trivialities 1,000 times repeated. The face that was most dear to him, that of Christ, the center of the picture, which had so enraptured him when he first discovered it, now regarded from the other standpoint seemed quite worthless. He saw a well-painted, and not even that. For he detected a multitude of errors, repetition of those innumerable Christs, Titians, Raphaels, Rubens, with the same warriors and the same pilots. It was trivial, poor, old, and even badly painted, weak and lacking harmony. They would be in the right when they began to say falsely polite things in the presence of the artist, and to pity and laugh at him behind his back. The silence grew to unbearable, though it had not lasted more than a minute to break it and to appear calm. He made an effort and addressed Kolishev. "I think I had the pleasure of meeting you," he said, glancing uneasily now at Anna and now at Vronsky in order not to lose any detail of their expressions. "Of course, we first met at Ross's, don't you remember? That evening, when the Italian lady recited the new Rachel," began Golenishev, glibly turning away from the picture to the artist, without the slightest regret, noticing, however, that Mikhailov was waiting to hear his criticism of the picture. He said, "Your picture has progressed very much since I last saw it, and now as then I am especially struck by the figure of Pilate. One can so well understand that man, a kind first-rate fellow, but an official to his very backbone, who does not know what he is doing." But it seems to me the whole of Mikhailov's mobile face suddenly lighted up. His eyes brightened. He wanted to speak, but was too agitated and pretended to cough instead, little as he valued Golenishev's capacity to understand art. Unimportant as was his remark about the truth of Pilate's official expression, while what was important remained unmentioned, and offensive as was this trivial, it might have seemed to him, remark before anything had been said about what was most important, Mikhailov was delighted with it. His opinion of that figure was the same. The fact that this opinion was but one of a million of other opinions, which, as Mikhailov well knew, would all have been, just did not for him detract from the importance of Golenishev's remark. He took a liking to Golenishev because of that remark, and his depression changed suddenly into delight in an instant. His whole picture became alive before his eyes with the inexpressible complexity of everything that lives. He wished to say that it was just so that he understood Pilate, but his trembling lips would not obey him, and he was unable to speak. Vronsky and Anna were talking in the hushed voice, in which, partly not to offend the artist and partly not to utter aloud a stupid remark such as is so easily made when speaking about art, people generally talk at picture exhibitions. Mikhailov thought that on them to the picture had created an impression, and went up to them. How wonderful Christ's expression is, said Anna. That expression pleased her more than all else she saw, and she felt that it was the center of the picture, and that therefore praise of it would be agreeable to the artist. One sees his sorrow for Pilate. This too was one of a million just remarks which might have been made with reference to his picture and the figure of Christ. She said he was sorry for Pilate. In Christ's expression there should be pity, because there was love in it, a peace not of this world, a readiness for death, and a knowledge of the vanity of words. Of course, there was an official expression in Pilate's face and pity in Christ's, for the former was the embodiment of carnal, and the latter of spiritual life. All this and much more floated through Mikhailov's mind, and again his face shone with ecstasy. Yes, and how well that figure is done, and what an atmosphere there is. One could walk round it, said Golenishev, showing evidently by this remark that he did not approve of the content and idea of the figure. Yes, it is wonderfully masterly how those figures in the background stand out. That is technique, said Vronsky, addressing Golenishev and alluding to a conversation they had had about Vronsky's despair of attaining technical mastery. Yes, yes, wonderful, chimed in Golenishev, and Anna, in spite of his elation, this remark about technique grated painfully on Mikhailov's heart, and glancing angrily at Vronsky, he suddenly frowned. He often heard the word technique mentioned, and did not at all understand what was meant by it. He knew it meant a mechanical capacity to paint and draw quite independent of the subject matter. He had often noticed, as now when his picture was being praised, that technique was contrasted with inequality, as if it were possible to paint well something that was bad. He knew that Much attention and care were needed not to injure one's work when removing the wrappings that obscure the idea, and that all wrappings must be removed. But as to the art of painting, the technique, it did not exist. If the things he saw had been revealed to a little child or to his cook, they would have been able to remove the outer shell from their idea. And the most experienced and technical painter could never paint anything by means of mechanical skill alone if the outline of the subject matter did not first reveal itself to his mind. Moreover, he saw that if technique was spoken of, then he could not be praised for it. In all he painted and ever had painted, he saw defects that were an eyesore to him. The results of carelessness in removing the shell of the idea, which he could not now remedy, without spoiling the work as a whole, and in almost all the figures and faces, he saw traces of wrappings that had not been entirely removed, and that spoiled the picture. One thing might be said, if you will allow me to make the remark, began Galunashavo. I shall be very pleased. Pray do, said Mikhailov with a feigned smile. It is that you have made him a man-god, and not a god-man, however. I know that you wish to do so. I could not paint a Christ whom I had not in my soul. Mikhailov rejoined gloomily, yes. But in that case, if I may say what I think, your picture is so good that a remark of mine cannot do it any harm. Besides which is only my personal opinion. Yours is different. The idea itself is different. But let us take Ivanov for example. I consider that if Christ is to be brought down to the level of a historic figure, it would be better to choose another historic theme, a fresh one as yet untouched. But if this is the highest theme open to art, well, other themes can be found if one looks for them. But the fact is, art won't stand discussion and argument. Yet Ivanov's picture suggests both to a believer and an unbeliever the question, is this a god or not a god? And the unity of impression is destroyed. Why so? To me it seems that for educated people such questions can no longer exist, said Mikhailov. Galanachev did not agree with this, and keeping to his first contention, that unity of impression is indispensable in art, he confuted Mikhailov. The artist was perturbed, but could find nothing to say in defense of his opinion. Chapter 12. Anna and Vronsky had long been exchanging glances, regretting their friend's clever loquacity, and at last Vronsky, without waiting for his host, crossed the room to look at another and smaller picture. Oh, how charming, wonderful, charming, he and Anna began both at once. What is it they like so much? wondered Mikhailov. He had forgotten all about that picture painted 3 years before. He had forgotten all the sufferings and raptures he had gone through on account of that work, when it alone had occupied him unremittingly. Day and night for 3 months he had forgotten it, as he forgot all his finished pictures. He did not even like looking at it, and had only brought it out because he was expecting an Englishman who wished to buy it. Oh, that's nothing. Only an old study, he said. How good, remarked colony chef, evidently sincerely impressed by the charm of the picture. It represented Du Bois angling in the shade of a willow. The elder had just thrown the line, and quite absorbed in his occupation was carefully drawing the float from behind a bush. The younger one lay in the grass, leaning on his elbows, with his fair tousled head in his hands, and with dreamy blue eyes gazing at the water. What was he thinking about? Their delight in his picture aroused in Mikhailov his former excitement, but he feared and disliked their idle interest in his past work, and therefore, though their praises gave him pleasure, he tried to draw his visitor's attention to a third picture. But Vronsky inquired whether this picture was for sale to Mikhailov. In his excitement over their visit, this mention of money matters was very disagreeable. It is put out for sale, he replied, frowning darkly, when the visitors had left. Mikhailov sat down before his picture of Pilate and Christ and mentally reviewed all that had been said, and even what was not said, but only hinted by the visitors. Strange to say, what had weight with him while they were there, and he looked at things from their point of view, suddenly lost all significance. Now he looked at his picture with his artistic perception fully alert, and reached that assurance of the perfection and consequent importance of his picture which he needed to attain the intensity of effort, excluding all other interests, without which he could not work. The foreshortening of Christ's foot was, however, not right. He took his palette and commenced working while correcting the foot. He kept glancing at the figure of John in the background, which the visitors had not even remarked, but which he knew to be the height of perfection. when he had completed the foot, he was about to do something to that figure. But felt that he was too agitated. He could work neither when he was too indifferent nor when he was too highly roused, and saw everything too distinctly. There was only one stage between calmness and inspiration at which work was possible. And today he was too excited. He was about to cover his picture, but paused, and holding up the sheet stood a long time, with a rapturous smile, gazing at the figure of John, at length tearing himself away from it regretfully. He let the sheet fall over the picture and went home tired, but happy. Vronsky, Anna, and Golnichev were particularly animated and high-spirited on their way back. They talked about Mikhailov and his pictures, the word talent, which they understood to mean an innate and almost physical capacity independent of mind and heart, and which was their term for everything an artist lives through, occurred very often in their conversation, since they required it as a name for something which they did not at all understand, but about which they wanted to talk. They said that it was impossible to deny his talent, but that his talent could not develop because of his lack of education, the common misfortune of our Russian artists. But the picture of the boys had gripped their memories, and they kept coming back to it. How charming, how well he has hit it off, and how simply he does not even understand how good it is. Yes, we must not miss the opportunity of purchasing it. Vronsky declared. Chapter 13. Mikhailov sold Vronsky the picture and consented to paint Anna's portrait on the appointed day. He came and began working. After the 5th sitting, the portrait struck everyone, not only by its likeness, but also by its beauty. It was strange that Mikhailov had been able to discover that special beauty. One needed to know and love her as I love her to find just that sweetest spiritual expression of hers, thought Vronsky, though he himself had only learned to know that sweetest spiritual expression through the portrait. But the expression was so true that it seemed both to him and to others that they had always known it. How long have I been struggling without accomplishing anything, he said, referring to the portrait he was painting. And he just looked and painted this. That is where technique comes in. That will come in good time, said Golnichev consolingly. Vronsky had talent, and especially the education. That gives a lofty outlook on art. Galileo's conviction that Vronsky possessed talent was supported by the fact that he required Vronsky's sympathy and praise for his articles and ideas, and felt that praise and encouragement should be mutual in another man's house, and particularly in Vronsky's palazzo. Mikhailov was quite a different man from what he was in his studio. He was unpleasantly deferential, as if fearful of intimacy with persons whom he did not respect. He addressed Vronsky as Your Excellency, and never stayed to dinner, though Anna and Vronsky both invited him. And he never came except for a sitting. Anna was even kinder to him than to others, and was grateful for her portrait. Vronsky was more than polite to him, and was evidently interested in the artist's opinion of his. Vronsky's picture. Golnichev never missed an opportunity to instill into Mikhailov a true understanding of art, but the latter remained equally cold toward them all. Anna felt by his look that he liked looking at her, but he avoided conversation with her. When Vronsky talked about his art, Mikhailov remained stubbornly silent, and as stubbornly silent when they showed him Vronsky's picture, and he was evidently oppressed by Golnichev's discourses, to which he made no rejoinder altogether. His reserved, disagreeable, and apparently hostile attitude, when they came to know him better, much displeased them, and they were glad when the sittings were over. The beautiful portrait was theirs, and his visits ceased. Golnichev was the first to express the thought that was in all their minds, namely, that Mikhailov was simply jealous of Vronsky. We won't say jealous, because he has talent, but he is vexed that a man of the court, a rich man, and account into the bargain men like him, hate all that should, without any particular difficulty, do as well or even better than he who has devoted his whole life to the work. Especially there is the education which he lacks. Vronsky took Mikhailov's part, but in the depth of his heart he believed what Golnichev said, for he considered that a man of that other and lower world must envy him. On his portrait, the same subject painted from nature by both of them should have shown him the difference between Mikhailov and himself. But Vronsky did not see it. He merely left off painting Anna, deciding that it would be superfluous now. He went on, however, with his medieval picture, and he as well as Galinchev and especially Anna thought it very good because it resembled famous pictures much more than Mikhailov's did. Meanwhile, Mikhailov, though Anna's portrait had much engrossed him, was even better pleased than they when the sittings were over, and he was no longer obliged to listen to Galanishev's disquisitions on art, and was able to forget Vronsky's paintings. He knew it was not possible to forbid Vronsky to trifle with art, knew that he and all the dilettanti had a perfect right to paint what they liked, but to him it was unpleasant. One cannot forbid a man's making a big wax doll and kissing it, but if the man came and sat down with his doll in front of a lover and began to caress it as the lover caresses his beloved, it would displease the lover. It was this kind of unpleasantness that Mikhailov experienced when he saw Vronsky's pictures. He was amused, vexed, sorry, and hurt Vronsky's interest in art. And the Middle Ages did not last long. He had sufficient taste for art to be unable to finish his picture. He ceased painting it because he was dimly conscious that its defects, little noticeable at first, would become striking if he went on. The same thing happened to him as to Galanishov, who, feeling that he had nothing to express, continually deceived himself by saying that his thought had not yet ripened, and that he was bringing it to maturity and preparing materials. But Galanishov was embittered and tormented by it, while Vronsky could not deceive and torment himself, and above all could not become embittered. With characteristic firmness, he left off painting, without any explanations or excuses. But without that occupation his life, and Anna's, who was surprised at his disenchantment, appeared very dull in the Italian town. All of a sudden, the palazzo became so obviously old and dirty, so disagreeably familiar with the stains on the curtains, the cracks in the floor, the cracked stuccos of the cornices, and so wearisome became Galanish, the Italian professor, and the German traveler, who were also always the same, that a change was necessary. So they decided to return to Russia and live in the country in Petersburg. Vronsky planned to separate his property from his brothers, and Anna to see her son. The summer they intended to spend on Vronsky's large family estate. Chapter 14. Levin had been married 3 months. He was happy, but in quite a different way from what he had expected. At every step, he met disillusionment in his old fancies and new and unexpected enchantments. He was happy, but having embarked on family life, he saw at every step that it was not at all what he had anticipated. At every step he took, he felt as a man would feel who, after admiring the smooth, happy motion of a little boat upon the water, had himself got into the boat. He found that besides sitting quietly, without rocking, he had to keep a lookout, not for a moment forget where he was going, or that there was water under his feet, and that he had to row, although it hurt his unaccustomed hands. In short, that it only looked easy, but to do it, though very delightful, was very difficult. As a bachelor, seeing the married life of others, their petty cares, their disputes, their jealousies, he used mentally to smile contemptuously. In his future married life, he was sure he would have nothing of this kind, and even the external forms of his married life would be quite unlike other people's. And now behold, his life with his wife had not shaped itself differently, but was all made up of those petty trifles which he had formerly so despised, but which now against his will assumed an unusual and incontestable importance. Levin saw that the arrangement of all those trifles was not at all so easy as he had formerly supposed. Though he had imagined his ideas about family life to be most exact, he, like all men, had involuntarily pictured it to himself as merely the enjoyment of love, which nothing should be allowed to hinder, and from which one should not be distracted by petty cares. He should, he thought, do his work and rest from it. In the joys of love she should be loved, and that was all. But like all men, he forgot that she too must work, and was surprised how she, the poetic, charming Kitty, could during the very first weeks, and even in the first days of married life, think, remember, and fuss about tablecloths, furniture, spare room mattresses, tray, the cook, the dinner, and so forth. During their engagement, he had been struck by the definiteness with which she declined a trip abroad and decided to go to the country, as if she knew of something that was necessary and could think of something besides their love. He had been pained by it then, and now was repeatedly pained by her petty cares, but he saw that this was necessary to her in loving her. Though he could not understand what it was all about, and laughed at her worries, he could not help admiring them. He laughed at the way she placed the furniture, that had been brought from Moscow and rearranged his and her own rooms, hung up curtains, decided about rooms for future visitors, and for Dolly arranged the room for her new maid, gave orders about dinner to the old cook, and entered into discussions with Agafya Mikhailovna, taking the commissariat into her own hands. He saw the old cook smile admiringly and listened to her inexperienced and impossible orders, saw that Agafya Mikhailovna shook her head thoughtfully and kindly at her young mistress's arrangements in the storeroom, saw that Kitty was peculiarly charming when she came, half laughing and half crying to report that her maid Marcia was used to considering her merely as a young lady in her mother's house, and that therefore no one would obey her. It struck him as very charming but strange, and he thought it would have been better without all that. He did not realize the feeling of change that she was experiencing after her life at home. There she had sometimes wished for cabbage with caviar or sweets, and could not have them. But now she might order whatever she pleased, and could, if she liked, buy heaps of sweets, spend any amount of money, and order all the pudding she pleased. She looked forward joyfully to Dolly's coming, with the children especially, because she meant to give each of them their favorite puddings, and because Dolly would appreciate her new arrangements. Without herself knowing why or wherefore, the management of the house attracted her irresistibly. Instinctively feeling the approach of spring, and knowing that there would be wet weather, she built her nest as she could, hastening to build it while yet learning how to do it. Kitty's absorption in these trifles, quite contrary to Levin's early ideal of lofty happiness, was one of his disappointments. Yet that sweet absorption, the meaning of which she could not understand, but which she could not help liking, was also one of his new enchantments. Another disenchantment and new enchantment was afforded by their quarrels. Levin had never thought it possible that between him and his wife there could ever be any but tender, respectful, and loving relations, and yet from the very beginning they had quarreled. She had said he did not love her, but only loved himself, and began to cry and wave her arms. This first quarrel arose because Liavane had ridden over to see his new farm and returned half an hour late, having attempted a shortcut home and lost his way. He rode home thinking only of her love, and of his happiness, and the nearer he came, the warmer grew his tenderness for her. He ran into the room with the same feelings as, and even stronger ones than those with which he had gone to the Sherbakovsky house to propose, and to his astonishment was met with such a dismal look as he had never seen on her face before. He tried to kiss her, but she pushed him away. "What's the matter? You seem merry," she began, wishing to say something calmly stinging, but directly she opened her mouth, words of reproach, senseless jealousy, and everything else that had been torturing her during the half hour she had sat motionless waiting at the window, burst from her. Then it was that he first clearly understood what he did not realize when leading her out of church after the wedding, that she was not only very close to him, but that he could not now tell where she ended. And he understood this by a tormenting sensation of cleavage which he experienced at that moment. For an instant he was offended, but immediately knew he could not be offended with her, because she was himself. For a moment he felt like a man who, receiving a blow from behind, angrily and revengefully turns around to find his assailant and realizes that he has accidentally knocked himself, that there is no one to be angry with, and that he must endure and try to still the pain. Never again did he feel this so strongly as this first time, and for a long time he could not recover his balance. His natural feelings prompted him to justify himself and prove that she was in the wrong, but to prove her in the wrong would mean irritating her still more and widening the breach which was the cause of all the trouble. One impulse, an habitual one, drew him to shift the blame from himself and lay it upon her, but another and more powerful one drew him to smooth over the breach as quickly as possible and not allow it to widen. To remain under so unjust an accusation was painful, but to justify himself and hurt her would be still worse. Like a man half asleep and oppressed with pain, he wanted to tear off the aching part and cast it from him, but found on waking that the aching part was himself. All he could do was to try to soothe the ache and endure it, and this he did. They made it up. Having realized that she was in the wrong, though she did not acknowledge it, she became more tender to him, and they enjoyed a new and doubled happiness in their love. but this did not prevent such collisions recurring quite frequently, and on very unexpected and trivial provocation these collisions were often caused by each not realizing what was important to the other, and also by the fact that in those early days they were often in low spirits when one of them was in good spirits, and the other was not. Peace was not broken, but if both chanced to be out of sorts, collisions resulted from causes so trifling as to be incomprehensible. Often afterwards, they could not remember what they had quarreled about. However, when both were in good spirits, their happiness was doubled, and yet the early days of their married life were very trying. All that time, they were conscious of peculiar strain, as if the chain that bound them were being pulled first one way, and then the other altogether. The honeymoon, the first month of their marriage, from which Levin had expected so much, was not delightful, but remained in both their recollections as the most oppressive and humiliating time of their lives. They both tried in afterlife to efface from their memories all the ugly, shameful circumstances of this unhealthy time, during which they were rarely in a normal state, and rarely themselves. Only in the third month of their married life, after returning from Moscow, where they had spent a month, did their life begin to run more smoothly. Chapter 15. They had just returned from Moscow, and were glad of the solitude. He was in his study, and sat at the table writing, she in the dark lilac dress she had worn during the first days of her marriage, and which was especially memorable and dear to him, sat with her embroidery on that same old leather-covered sofa, which had stood in the study through his father's and grandfather's times. As he sat thinking and writing, he was all the while blissfully conscious of her presence. He had not abandoned his work on the estate, or on the book in which the foundations of a new farming system were to be explained, but as those thoughts and that work formerly appeared to him trivial and insignificant in comparison with the gloom that overshadowed all existence, so now they appeared trivial and insignificant in comparison with his future prospects. All bathed in the bright sunshine of happiness, he went on with his work with a feeling that the center of gravity of his attention had shifted, and that he consequently saw the matter differently and with greater clearness. Formerly this work had been his salvation from life. He used to feel that without it life would be too dismal, and now he needed it in order that his life should not be too monotonously bright. Having set to work again on his manuscript and read over what he had written, he was glad to find that the work seemed worth doing. Many of his former thoughts now appeared superfluous and extreme, but many omissions became clear to him when he went over the matter afresh. He was writing a fresh chapter on why agriculture was not profitable in Russia. He argued that Russia's poverty was caused not only by a wrong distribution of landed property and a false policy, but that of late years those evils have been fostered by a foreign civilization artificially grafted upon Russia, especially as to ways of communication, because the railways, which had conduced to a centralization in the cities, a growth of luxury, and consequently to a development of factories at the expense of agriculture, and attendant upon this, to credit operations and speculation. It seemed to him that when the growth of a nation's wealth is normal, these things follow only after a considerable amount of labor has been devoted to agriculture, and after the latter has been placed in its rightful, or at any rate in a definite position, that a nation's wealth ought to grow proportionately at the same rate in all its branches, and especially in such a way that the other branches should not outdistance agriculture. That means of communication should conform to the agricultural conditions, and that with our wrong methods of using the land, the railways, brought about not by economic but by political necessity, had come prematurely, and instead of promoting agriculture as had been expected, had interfered with it and hindered it by stimulating the development of manufactures, and credit therefore as the one-sided and premature development of a single organ in an animal would injure its general development. So credit railways and the forced growth of manufacturers, though undoubtedly necessary in Europe where the time was right for them, had in Russia only harmed the general development of wealth by thrusting aside the most important current question, namely the organization of agriculture. While he was writing his thoughts, she was thinking about his unnatural attention to young Prince Charsky, who had been very tactlessly paying court to her. On the day before their departure from Moscow, why he's jealous, she thought, oh dear, how sweet and silly he is jealous of me. If he only knew that all the rest of them are no more than Pieter the cook to me. And she glanced with a feeling of proprietorship strange to herself at the nape of his neck. Though it's a pity to interrupt him at his work, but he'll have time enough. I must see his face. Will he feel that I am looking at him? I want him to turn. I want it well. And she opened her eyes wider, trying thereby to increase the force of her look. Yes, they divert all the sap, they produce a false glamour, he muttered, pausing, and feeling that she was looking at him, he turned round smiling. Well, he asked with a smile and rose. He has turned, she thought. Nothing, I only wanted to make you turn round, said she, gazing at him and trying to discover whether he was vexed at the interruption. I say, how delightful it is for us to be alone together. For me, I mean, he said, coming toward her with a beaming smile of happiness. It is delightful for me too. I shan't go anywhere, especially not to Moscow. And what were you thinking about? I was thinking, no, go and ride. Don't let me distract you, she said, puckering her lips. And I must cut out these little holes, you see. Taking up her scissors, she began cutting. Come, tell me what it was, he said, sitting down beside her and watching the circular movement of her tiny scissors. Oh, what was I thinking about? About Moscow and about the nape of your neck. Why should such happiness come just to me? It's not natural. It is too beautiful, he said, kissing her hand. To me, the more beautiful it is, the more natural it seems. Your hair comes to a point behind, he said, carefully turning her head round. A point? Yes, so it does there. But enough, we are engaged on serious matters. But their serious matters did not get on, and they jumped apart guiltily when Kuchma came to say that tea was served. And have they returned from town? Levin inquired of Gutzman. They've just come and are unpacking. Be quick and come, she said as she left the study, or else I shall read all the letters without you, and after that let's have a duet. Left alone, having put away his papers in the new portfolio she had bought, he washed his hands at the new washstand with the new and elegant utensils that had also appeared through her agency. He smiled at his thought and shook his head disapprovingly at it. A feeling resembling repentance tormented him. There was something contemptible, effeminate, Capuchin, as he called it, in his present life. It is not right to live. So he thought, soon it will be 3 months since I did anything worth mentioning. This is almost the first day that I have really set to work seriously. And what has come of it? Scarcely had I begun when I stopped even my usual duties, almost abandoned the farm work. Why, I hardly even go and see about that. Sometimes I am sorry to part from her. Sometimes I can see she is dull, and I used to think that up to the time of my marriage life would go on just so anyhow and not count for much. But that after marriage real life was going to begin, and now that is nearly 3 months ago, and I have never spent my days more idly or uselessly. No, this can't go on. I must make a beginning. Of course it is not her fault. There is nothing to reproach her with. I ought to have been firmer and upheld my independence as a man. This way I shall get into bad habits and teach them to her too. Of course, it is not her fault, he said to himself, but it is difficult for a dissatisfied man not to reproach someone else, namely the person most closely connected with the subject of his dissatisfaction. And Levin dimly felt that though she was not herself in fault, she never could be in fault. It was the fault of her bringing up, which was too superficial and frivolous. That fool Chasky, I knew she wanted to stop him, but did not know how. He thought, yes, except for the interest she takes in the housekeeping, that interest she certainly has. Her clothes and her embroidery. She has no real interest. She takes no interest in our work in the farm and the peasants, or in music, though she is quite good at that, or in books. She does nothing and is quite content. In his heart he blamed her, but he did not understand that she was preparing herself for a period of activity which was inevitably coming, when at one and the same time she would be her husband's wife, the mistress of the house, and a bearer, nurturer, and educator of her children. He did not understand that, but she knew it instinctively, and while getting ready for her gigantic task she did not reproach herself for the moments of careless and happy love that she now enjoyed while building her nest for the future. Chapter 16. When Levin came upstairs, His wife was sitting beside the new silver samovar with a new tea service before her, reading a letter from Dolly, with whom she kept up a regular and active correspondence. She had made old Agafya Mikhailovna sit at a little table with a cup of tea. She had poured out for her. "You see, your lady has made me sit with her," said Agafya Mikhailovna, glancing with a friendly smile at Kitty. In these words of Agafya Mikhailovna's Liven read the conclusion of the drama, which had lately been enacted. Between Agafya Mikhailovna and Kitty, he perceived that despite Agafya Mikhailovna's grief at the advent of the new mistress, who had taken the reins of management into her own hands, Kitty had conquered and had made the old woman love her. "There, I've read your letter," said Kitty, handing him a badly written letter. "It is from that woman. I think your brothers know I have not read it. These are from home and from Dolly. Fancy, Dolly took Grisha and Tanya to a children's party. At the Sarmatskys, Tanya went to the Marquise's, but Levin did not listen. He blushed as he took Maria Kovalova's letter. This was the second letter he had received from the woman who had been his brother's mistress. In the first she wrote that his brother had sent her away for no fault of hers, adding with touching naivety that though she was again in want, she did not ask or desire anything, but wrote because she was crushed by the thought that Nikolai Dmitrievich would perish without her. His health being so bad, she begged Levin to keep watch over his brother. This time she wrote differently. She had found Nikolai Dmitrievich, had joined him in Moscow, and had gone with him to a provincial town where he had obtained a post in the civil service. But he had quarreled with his chief, and they had started again for Moscow when he fell so ill on the way that it was hardly likely he would ever get up again. She wrote, "He keeps on thinking of you. Besides, there is no money left. Read it." Dolly writes about you. Kitty began with a smile, but paused suddenly, noticing the changed expression on her husband's face. "What's the matter? What is it?" She writes, "That my brother Nikolai is on his deathbed. I'm going." Kitty's look changed at once. Thoughts of Tanya as a marquise and of Dolly had quite vanished. "When are you going?" she asked. "Tomorrow I shall go to." "May I?" "Kitty, what do you mean?" he said reproachfully. "What indeed?" she replied, offended that he seemed opposed to and vexed at her offer. "Why should I not go? I shan't be in your way." I am going because my brother is dying," said Liven. "But why should you?" "Why, for the same reason as you. At such an important time she thinks only of how dull it will be for her alone." Here he thought on this motive and connection with something so important vexed him. "It is impossible," he replied sternly. Agafya Mikhailovna, seeing that a quarrel was imminent, softly put down her cup and went out. Kitty did not even notice her. The tone in which her husband had said these words hurt her, especially as he evidently disbelieved what she had said. "And I say that if you go, I shall go with you." "I will certainly go," she said hastily and angrily. "Why is it impossible?" "Why do you say it is impossible?" "Because it means going goodness knows where, and by what roads to what inns. You would be in my way," said Levin, endeavoring to keep cool. "Not at all. I shan't want anything, and where you can go I can." "Well, if only because that woman is there with whom you cannot associate. I don't know and don't want to know anything about who and what is there. I know that my husband's brother is dying, that my husband is going to him, and that I am going with my husband and all." "Kitty, don't be angry, but just think this matter is so important. It hurts me to think that you are mixing up with it your weakness, your dislike of remaining alone. Well, if you feel dull alone, well, go to Moscow. There you see. You always attribute bad and vile motives to me." She began with tears of anger and resentment. "I am all right, not weak, not anything. I feel that it's my duty to be with my husband when he is in trouble. But you wish to hurt me on purpose. You purposely don't want to understand me. No, this is awful, being a sort of slave," exclaimed Levin, unable to restrain his annoyance any longer, but immediately conscious that he had dealt a blow to himself. "Then why did you marry? You might have been free." "Why, since you are repenting," she said, and jumped up and ran into the drawing room. When he came in after her, she was sobbing. He began speaking, trying to find words not so much to dissuade as to pacify her, but she did not listen and did not agree to anything he said. He stooped and took her resisting hand. He kissed her hand, her hair, and again her hand, but she remained silent. But when he took her face in his hands and said, "Kitty," she suddenly recovered, cried a little, and then they made it up. It was settled that they would start together the next day. Levin told his wife he believed she only wanted to go, that she might be of use, and agreed that Maria Kovalova's presence at his brother's would not make it at all improper. But he was going dissatisfied in the depths of his heart with both himself and her. He was dissatisfied with her because she could not face letting him go when it was necessary, and how strange it was to think that he who such a short time ago dared not believe in the happiness of her loving him now felt unhappy because she loved him too much and dissatisfied with himself. Because he had not maintained his authority, still less could he with conviction agree that the woman who was with his brother did not matter. And he thought with terror of all the encounters that might take place. The single fact that his wife, his Kitty, would be in the same room with a girl off the streets made him shudder with repulsion and horror. Chapter 17. The hotel in the provincial town where Nikolai Levin was lying ill was one of those provincial hotels arranged after new and improved models, with the best intentions of cleanliness, comfort, and even elegance, but which, owing to the people who used them, very soon degenerate into mere dirty pothouses with pretensions to modern improvements, these very pretensions making them worse than the old-fashioned inns, which were simply dirty. This hotel had already reached this stage. Everything: the soldier in a dirty uniform smoking a cigarette at the front door, acting as a hall porter; the dismal and unpleasant cast iron staircase; the free and easy waiter in a dirty dress coat; the general room with a dusty bouquet of wax flowers decorating the table; the dust and slovenliness everywhere mingled with a kind of modern self-satisfied railway-induced state of bustle. All this caused a feeling of depression in the Levins, after their fresh home life especially, as the air of artificiality about this hotel was quite irreconcilable with what was awaiting them. As usual, after the inquiry as to what priced rooms they desired, it turned out that there was not a single good room vacant. One good room was occupied by a railway inspector, another by a lawyer from Moscow, a third by the Princess Astafyeva from the country. There was just one dirty room to be had, but they were promised that an adjoining one would be free by the evening. Vexed with his wife because his expectations were being realized, namely that at the moment of arrival, when his heart was seized with agitation at the thought of his brother's condition, he was obliged to consider her instead of running to him at once. Levin led her to the room. Go, she said with a timid, guilty look at him. He went out silently, and at the very door came upon Maria Nikolaevna, who had heard of his arrival, but had not dared to enter. She was just the same as he had seen her in Moscow. The same stuff dress without collar or cuffs, and the same kindly, dull, pock-marked face, only somewhat stouter. Well, how is he? What is it? Very bad. Does not get up. He was expecting you all the time. You are with your wife. For a moment he did not understand the cause of her confusion, but she immediately explained it. I will go to the kitchen. She brought out, he will be pleased. He heard, and he knows and remembers her abroad. Levin understood that she referred to his wife, and did not know what to say. Come along, come, he said, but he had hardly moved when the door opened and Kitty looked out. Levin blushed with shame and vexation at his wife for having placed herself and him in this awkward position, but Maria Nikolaevna blushed still more. She shrank together, flushed till tears filled her eyes, and seizing the ends of her shawl began twisting them in her red fingers, not knowing what to say or do. At the first glance Levin saw an expression of eager curiosity in the look with which Kitty gazed at this incomprehensible and terrible woman, but it lasted only an instant. Well, how is he? She said, addressing first her husband, and then the woman. Dear me, we can't talk in the corridor, said Levin, looking crossly at a man who was just passing along with jerky steps, ostensibly on business of his own. Well then, come in, said Kitty to Maria Kovalova, who had regained her self-control, or better still, you go on and send for me. She continued, noticing her husband's frightened look, and then returned to their room. Levin went to his brother. He had not expected what he saw, and felt when he reached his brother's side he had expected to find him in that state of self-deception which he had heard was frequent in consumptive cases, and which had so struck him at the time of his brother's visit to him in the autumn. He had expected to find the physical signs of approaching death more definite. Greater weakness, greater emaciation, but still the same sort of condition generally. He had expected to feel the same sorrow at the loss of a loved brother, and the same horror of death he had then experienced, but to a greater degree, and had prepared himself for all this. But what he found was quite different in the dirty little room, with a painted dado spotted with spittle behind the thin partition wall, of which could be heard the sound of voices in stuffy, smelly foul air. On a bed drawn away from the wall lay a body covered with a blanket. One arm of that body lay outside the blanket, and the enormous hand like a rake seemed to be attached in some incomprehensible way to a long thin spindle that was quite straight. From the end to the middle, the head lay on its side on the pillow. Levin could see the moist thin hair on the temples, and the drawn transparent looking forward. Impossible that this terrible body can be my brother Nikolai, he thought. But he drew nearer, saw the face, and doubt was no longer possible. In spite of the dreadful change on the face, Levin had only to glance at those living eyes raised toward him, to notice the slight movement of the mouth beneath the clammy mustache, in order to understand the dreadful truth that this dead body was his living brother. The glittering eyes glanced severely and reproachfully at the brother who was entering, and this glance immediately established living relations. Between living people, Levin at once felt the reproach in the look fixed on him, and a sense of repentance because of his own happiness. When Constantine took him by the hand, Nikolai smiled. The smile was very faint, hardly perceptible, and in spite of it the stern expression of the eyes did not change. "You did not expect to find me like this," he said, speaking with difficulty. "Yes, no," said Levin, confusing his words. "How is it you did not let me know sooner? I mean, at the time of my marriage. I inquired for you everywhere." He was impelled to speak in order not to remain silent, but did not know what to say, especially as his brother made no reply, but only gazed fixedly at him, evidently trying to fathom the meaning of every word. Levin told his brother that his wife had come with him. Nikolai seemed pleased at this, but said he was afraid the condition he was in might frighten her. A silence followed. Suddenly Nikolai moved and began to talk. From his expression, Levin expected him to say something especially significant and important, but Nikolai only talked about his health. He found fault with the doctor and regretted that he could not have a celebrated Moscow doctor, so Levin understood that. He was still hoping. Taking advantage of the first moment of silence, Levin got up, wishing to free himself, if only for a few minutes, from his painful sensations, and said he would fetch his wife. "All right, and I will have the place cleaned up a bit. It is dirty here, smells, I should think." "Mashe Tanya," said the invalid with an effort, "and when you're finished, go away," he added with a questioning look at his brother. Levin did not reply. He went out and stopped in the corridor. He had said he would bring his wife, but now, analyzing the impressions he was experiencing, he made up his mind that he would on the contrary try to dissuade her from entering the sick room. "Why should she to be tortured as I am?" he reflected. "Well, how is he?" Kitty asked with a frightened look. "Oh, it's awful, awful. Why did you come?" said Levin. Kitty was silent a moment, looking timidly and pitifully at her husband. Then she approached and took hold of his elbow with both hands. "Kostya, take me to him. It will be easier for us to bear it together. Just take me there, and then go away." She began. "Try and realizes that for me to see you and not to see him is much more painful. There I can perhaps be of use to him, and you please let me," she entreated. As if her happiness depended on it, he was obliged to yield, and having recovered and quite forgotten Maria Nikolaevna, he returned with Kitty to his brother, stepping lightly and glancing repeatedly at her husband, showing him a brave face full of sympathy. She entered the sick room and, turning without haste, noiselessly closed the door. With noiseless steps she advanced toward the bedside, went round so that he need not turn his head, and at once, grasping his enormous skeleton hand with her fresh young one, pressed it, and with that sympathetic quiet animation which gives no offense and is natural only to women, she began to talk to him. "It was in Sodden we met, but we were not acquainted," she said. "You little thought I should one day be your sister. You would not have known me again?" he asked with a smile that had lit up his face at her entrance. "Oh yes, I should. What a good thing it is that you did send us word. Not a day passed without costly thinking and being anxious about you." The sick man's animation did not last long. She had not finished speaking before that stern, reproachful look of jealousy felt by the dying for the living settled on his face. "I'm afraid you are not quite comfortable here," she said, turning away from his penetrating glance and looking around the room, "We shall have to ask the landlord for another room and see that we are nearer to each other," she said to her husband. Chapter 18. Levin could not look at his brother calmly and could not be either natural or tranquil in his presence. When he entered the sick room, his eyes and his attention became clouded with his being conscious of it, and he did not see or distinguish the various details of his brother's condition. He smelt the terribly foul air, saw the dirt and disorder, the agonizing posture of the body, and heard the groans, but he felt there was no help for it. It never entered his head to consider all these details and imagine how that body was lying under the blanket, how the emaciated doubled-up shins, loins, and back were placed, and whether it would not be possible to place them more comfortably, or do something, if not to make him comfortable, at least to make his condition a little more tolerable. A cold shudder crept down his back when he began to think of those details. He was convinced beyond doubt that nothing could be done to prolong that life or to alleviate those sufferings, and the sick man was conscious of his brother's conviction that there was no help for him, and this irritated him. This made Levin's position still harder. To be in the sick room was torture to Levin, but to be absent from it was still worse. He went out continually on all sorts of pretexts, coming back and going out again, incapable of remaining alone. But Kitty felt and acted quite differently. When she saw the invalid, she pitied him, and that pity produced in her woman's soul not the horror and repulsion which it evoked in her husband, but a need for action, for finding out all the particulars of his condition, and a desire to help him. Those very details, the thought of which alone filled her husband with horror, at once arrested her attention. She sent for the doctors, sent to the chemists, made the maid she had brought with her help Maria Nikolaevna sweep, dust, and wash, and herself washed and scrubbed some articles and spread something under the blanket at her command. Things were brought in and taken out of the sick room. She herself went several times to their own room, and without paying any attention to the people she met, brought back with her sheets, pillowcases, towels, and shirts. The waiter, who was serving a meal to some engineers in the drawing room, came up several times at her summons with a cross look on his face, but could not help fulfilling her orders. She gave them with such kindly insistence that it was impossible to disobey her. Levin disapproved of all this, not believing that any good could come of it. To the invalid, above all, he was afraid that his brother might get angry about it. But the sick man, though apparently indifferent to it all, was not angry, but only ashamed, and on the whole appeared rather interested in what she was doing for him. When Levin opened the door on his return from the doctor's, whither Kitty had sent him, he saw the invalid at the moment when, at Kitty's command, Maria Nikolaevna and the waiter were putting a clean shirt on him. The long white skeleton back, with the enormous shoulder blades and protruding ribs and vertebrae, was bare, and Maria Nikolaevna, with the waiter's help, somehow got one of the shirt sleeves twisted and could not guide the long limp arm into it. Kitty, having hurriedly shut the door behind Levin, was not looking that way, but the invalid moaned, and she came toward him. "Be quick," she said. "Don't come here," muttered the sick man angrily. "I can myself." "What do you say?" asked Maria Nikolaevna. But Kitty had heard and understood that he felt embarrassed and uncomfortable at being stripped in her presence. "I'm not looking," she said, helping the arm in Maria Nikolaevna. "You go round to the other side and put it right," she added. "There is a little bottle in my handbag," she went on, turning to her husband, "you know, in the side pocket. Please go and get it, and meanwhile everything will be put straight here." When Levin returned with the bottle, he found the invalid arranged in bed and everything around him quite altered. Instead of the foul smell, there was an odor of vinegar and of scent, which Kitty, pouting her lips and puffing out her rosy cheeks, was blowing through a little glass tube. There was no trace of dust left about. There was a mat beside the bed. On the table, medicine bottles and a bottle of water were neatly placed, also a pile of folded linen, which would be required later, and Kitty's embroidery. On another table by the bedside were a glass of some refreshing drink and some powders. The invalid, himself washed and with his hair brushed, lay between clean sheets in a clean shirt, its white collar around his abnormally thin neck, gazing with a new look of hope at Kitty, and not taking his eyes off her. The doctor whom Levin had fetched and whom he had found at a club was not the one who would hear the two attending. Nikolai with whom the patient was dissatisfied. The new doctor took out a stethoscope and sounded him, shook his head, prescribed some medicine, and gave extremely precise instructions about giving the medicine. And about diet, he ordered raw or very lightly boiled eggs and seltzer water with new milk at a certain temperature. When the doctor had gone, the patient said something to his brother, of which Levin caught only the last words, "Your Kate," but by the look he gave her, Levin saw that his brother was praising her. He asked Kate as he called her to come nearer. "I feel much better," he said. "Had I been with you, I should have recovered long ago." How pleasant. He took her hand and drew it toward his lips, but as if fearful that this might be disagreeable to her, he changed his mind, let her hand drop, and merely stroked it. Kitty took his hand in both of hers and pressed it. "Now turn me over on the left side and go to bed," he murmured. No one heard what he said, but Kitty understood him. She understood, because her mind incessantly watched for his needs on the other side. She said to her husband, "He always sleeps on that side. Turn him over. It is unpleasant to call the servants, and I cannot do it. Can you?" she said, addressing Maria Nikolaevna. "I am afraid to," answered Maria Nikolaevna, dreadful as it seemed to Levin to put his arms around that terrible body, to grasp those parts under the blanket which he did not wish to remember yet. Submitting to his wife with that determined expression which she knew, he thrust his arms under the blanket, and despite his great strength was struck by the strange heaviness of those emaciated limbs while he was turning him with the enormous lean arm about his neck. Kitty quickly and unostentatiously turned and beat the pillow and arranged the invalid's head and the hair that again clung to the temples. The patient retained his brother's hand, and his Levin felt that he wished to do something with his hand and was pulling at it, and yielded with a sinking heart. Yes, his brother drew the hand to his lips and kissed it. Levin, trembling, choking with sobs, and unable to utter a word, left the room. Chapter 19. Thou hast hid these things from the wise and prudent, and hast revealed them unto babes, thought Evan while talking with his wife that night. He thought of the gospel text, not because he considered himself wise, he did not, but because he could not help knowing that he was more intelligent than his wife and Agafya Mikhailovna. He could not help knowing that when he thought about death, he thought with all the powers of his soul. He knew to that many great and virile minds, whose thoughts on that subject he had read, had pondered it, and yet did not know 1/100th part of what his wife and Agafya Mikhailovna knew on the subject, different as were those two women, Agafya Mikhailovna and Kitty, or Kate as Nikolai called her, and as Levin was also fond of calling her now. In that respect, they were exactly alike. Both knew with certainty what life was and what death was, and though they would have been quite unable not only to answer, but even to understand the questions which confronted Levin, neither doubted the importance of those phenomena, and they both had exactly the same outlook upon them, an outlook shared not only by them, but by millions of others. The proof that they knew surely what death was lay in the fact that they knew without a minute's hesitation how to behave with the dying, and did not fear them. But Levin and others, though they were able to say a great deal about death, evidently did not know anything, for they feared it, and had no notion what to do when people were dying. Had Levin now been alone with his brother Nikolai, he would have looked at him with horror, and would have waited about in still greater horror, not knowing what to do next. More than that, he did not know what to say, how to look, or how to step. To talk of indifferent things seemed an affront, and he could not do it. To talk of death and dismal things was likewise impossible, and it was equally impossible to keep silent. I fear that if I look at him, he will think I am watching. If I don't look, he will imagine I am thinking of something else. If I walk on tiptoe, he will be displeased, and yet I am ashamed to tread on the hole of my foot. But Kitty evidently did not think, and had no time to think of herself. She, prompted by some inner conviction, thought of him, and everything came out right. She talked to him about herself and about her wedding, smiled, sympathized, caressed him, mentioned cases of recovery, and it was all successful. So she evidently knew what she was about. The proof that her and Agafya Mikhailovna's behavior was not instinctive, animal, and unreasoning lay in the fact that they both demanded for the dying man something of greater importance than mere physical care. something that had nothing in common with physical conditions. Agafia Mikhailovna, speaking of the old man who had died, had said, "Well, God be thanked, he received communion and extreme unction. God grant everybody to die." So just in the same way, Kitty, besides all her cares about linen bedsores and cooling drinks, had managed on the very first day to persuade the invalid of the necessity of receiving communion and extreme unction. When Lievian returned to their two rooms for the night, he sat with hanging head, not knowing what to do. Not only could he not think of supper, of getting ready for the night, of considering what they were to do, he could not even talk to his wife. He was ashamed. To Kitty, on the contrary, was more active than usual and even more animated. She ordered supper to be brought, unpacked their things herself, helped to make the beds, and did not forget to sprinkle insect powder on them. She was in that highly wrought state when the reasoning powers act with great rapidity, the state a man is in before a battle or a struggle, in danger, and of the decisive moments of life, those moments when a man shows once for all what he is worth, that his past was not lived in vain, but was a preparation for these moments. All she did was well done, and before midnight everything was sorted clean and neat, so that their apartments showed a resemblance to her own rooms at home. Beds made, combs, brushes, and looking glasses laid out, and covers spread. It seemed to Levin that it would be inexcusable to eat, sleep, or even to talk, and he felt that his every movement was improper. She, however, sorted combs and brushes and did it all in such a way that there was nothing offensive about it. However, they could not eat anything nor sleep for a long time, and even did not go to bed till very late. "I am very glad I have persuaded him to receive extreme unction tomorrow," she said as she sat in her dressing jacket before her folding glass and combed her soft, fragrant hair with a small comb. "I have never been present, but Mama told me that there are prayers for the restoration of health. Do you really think he can recover?" he asked, looking at the back of her round little head, at the narrow parting which closed every time she drew the comb forward. "I asked the doctor. He says he can't live more than 3 days. But how can they know still? I am very glad I persuaded him," she said, turning her eyes toward her husband from behind her hair. "Everything is possible," she added with the peculiar and rather cunning expression which always appeared on her face when she spoke of religious matters. Since their talk about religion during their engagement, neither he nor she had ever started a conversation on that subject, but she continued to observe the rites, went to church, and prayed, always with the same quiet conviction that it was necessary to do so. In spite of his assurances to the contrary, she was persuaded that he was a Christian like and even better than herself, and that all he said about it was one of his funny male whims, like his sayings about her embroidery, that good people darn holes while she cut holes on purpose, and so on. "Yes, you see, that woman Maria Nikolaevna could not arrange all that," said Levin. I must confess I am very glad you came. You are purity itself." And he took her hand and did not kiss it. To do so with death so near seemed to him unbecoming, but only pressed it, looking guiltily into her brightening eyes. "It would have been so painful for you alone," she said, and raising her arms high so that they hid her cheeks, now flushed with pleasure, she twisted her braided hair and pinned it up at the back of her head. "No," she continued, "she did not know how to. Luckily, I learned a good deal in Sodden. Can there have been such sick people there? Oh, worse, it is so terrible to me that I cannot help seeing him as he was when young. You would not believe what a charming lad he was, and I did not understand him then. I quite believe it, quite. I feel that we should have been friends, he and I," she said, and frightened at her own words, she glanced at her husband and tears filled her eyes. "Yes, would have been," he said sadly. "He is really one of those of whom it is said they are not for this world. However, we have hard days before us. Let us go to bed," said Kitty with a glance at her tiny watch. Chapter 20. Death. Next day, the patient received communion and extreme unction. During the ceremony, he prayed fervently, in his large eyes fixed upon an icon which had been placed on a little table covered with a colored cloth. Was a look of such passionate entreaty and hope that Levin was frightened at seeing it. He knew that this passionate entreaty and hope would only make the parting from the life he so loved more difficult. Levin knew his brother and the direction of his thoughts, knew that he had become a skeptic, not because it was easier for him to live without faith, but because step-by-step modern scientific explanations of the phenomena of the universe had driven out his faith, he knew therefore that this return to the old faith was not legitimate, not a similar result of thought, but was only a temporary, selfish and irrational hope of recovery. Levin knew too that Kitty had strengthened that hope by tales of extraordinary recoveries of which she had heard. Knowing all this, Levin suffered much as he saw that look full of entreaty and hope, that emaciated hand lifted with effort in making the sign of the cross to touch the drawn skin of the forehead, the protruding shoulder blades, and a hollow horse chest which could no longer contain that life for which the invalid was praying. During the sacrament, Levin did that which, agnostic though he was, he had done 1,000 times before. He said, addressing himself to God, "If thou dost exist, heal this man. Such things have often happened, and thou wilt save both him and me." After receiving extreme unction, the invalid suddenly felt better. He did not cough once for a whole hour, smiled, kissed Kitty's hand, thanking her with tears in his eyes, and said he felt well, had no pain, but had an appetite and felt stronger. He even sat up when they brought him some soup and asked for cutlet, too hopeless as his case was, obvious as it was that he could not recover. Levin and Kitty were for that hour both in the same state of excitement, happy yet timid, and fearful of being mistaken. Better, yes, much better. Wonderful. It is not at all wonderful. Still, he's better, they said in whispers, smiling at one another. But this illusion did not last long. The invalid fell quietly asleep, but awoke half an hour later with a fit of coughing, and immediately every hope fled from those around him and from himself. The reality of his sufferings destroyed it, leaving no trace nor even any recollection of the former hopes. In Levin, Kitty, or the patient himself, not referring to what he had believed half an hour previously, as though he were ashamed to remember it, Nikolai told them to give him a bottle of iodine covered with perforated paper for inhaling. Levin handed it to him, and at once the look of passionate hope with which the invalid had received extreme unction was fixed on his brother, demanding from him a confirmation of the doctor's words to the effect that inhaling iodine worked miracles. "Kitty is not here?" he asked hoarsely, glancing round when Levin had reluctantly confirmed the doctor's statement. "No, that I can tell you. It's for her sake I went through that comedy. She's such a dear. But you and I cannot deceive ourselves like that now. In this I do believe," he said, clutching the bottle with his bony hand and beginning to inhale from it. Between 7 and 8 o'clock that evening, Levin and his wife were drinking tea in their room when Maria Nikolaevna rushed in breathless. "He's dying," she whispered. "I'm afraid he'll die." Immediately both ran to his room. He was sitting up with his long back bent, leaning his elbows on the bed and hanging his head. "What do you feel?" asked Levin in a whisper. After a pause, "I feel I am departing," uttered Nikolai with an effort, but very distinctly, as if he were pressing the words out of his body. He did not lift his head, but only turned up his eyes, failing to reach his brother's face. "Kate, go away," he added. Levin jumped up and in a commanding whisper told her to leave the room. "Departing?" Nikolai repeated. "Why do you think that?" asked Levin in order to say something. "Because I am departing," he repeated as if that word pleased him. "It's the end." Maria Nikolaevna approached. "You had better lie down. You would feel easier," she said. "I'll soon be lying," he said softly. "Dead," he added cynically and angrily. "Well, lay me down if you like." Levin laid his brother on his back, sat down beside him, and holding his breath gazed at his face. The dying man lay with closed eyes, but at intervals the muscles of his forehead worked as if he were thinking deeply and intently. Levin involuntarily meditated upon what was taking place within his brother at that moment, but in spite of all the efforts of his mind to follow, he saw by the expression of that calm, stern face and the play of the muscles above one eyebrow that something was becoming clear to the dying man, which for Levin remained as dark as ever. Yeah, that's so." Slowly pausing between words, the dying man murmured, "Wait a bit." He was silent again. "That's so," he drawled in a tone of relief, as if he had found a solution. "Oh God," he muttered with a heavy sigh. Maria Nikolaevna felt his feet growing cold. She whispered for a very long time, as it seemed to Levin. The invalid lay motionless, but he still lived, and at long intervals sighed. Levin was already wearied by the mental strain. He felt that despite all of his mental efforts, he could not understand what was so and was already lagging far behind his dying brother. He was no longer able to reflect on the actual problem of death, and could not hinder thoughts about what he would soon have to do to close his brother's eyes, dress him, order a coffin, and strange to say he felt quite cold, and experienced neither joy nor grief nor a sense of loss, still less of pity for his brother. If he had any feeling left for him, it was more like envy of that knowledge which the dying man now possessed, and which he might not share for a long time. He sat leaning over Nikolai, waiting for the end, but the end did not come. The door opened and Kitty appeared. Leovan rose to stop her, but at that moment he heard the dying man move. "Don't go," said Nikolai, and stretched out his hand. Leovan gave him his hand, signing angrily with the other to his wife, with his brother's hand in his. Leovan sat half an hour, then an hour, and yet another hour. He now no longer thought about death at all. He was wondering what Kitty was doing, who lived in the next room, and whether the doctor had a house of his own. He wished to eat and sleep. Carefully disengaging his hand, he felt his brother's feet. They were cold, but he was still breathing. Leovan tried to go out on tiptoe, but the invalid moved again and said, "Don't go." Day began to dawn, but the sick man's condition remained the same. Leovan gently disengaged his hand, and without looking at his brother, went to his own room and fell asleep. When he woke, instead of the news he expected, that his brother was dead, he heard that his former condition had returned. He again sat up, coughed, ate, and talked no longer of death, expressed hopes of recovery, and was even more irritable and depressed than before. No one, neither his brother nor Kitty, could comfort him. He was angry with everyone, said disagreeable things, blamed everybody for his sufferings, and demanded that they should fetch a celebrated doctor from Moscow. To all questions of how he felt, he gave the same answer with an angry and reproachful look: "I am suffering terribly, terribly." The sick man suffered more and more, especially from bedsores, which would no longer heal, and he grew more and more irritable with those about him, particularly because they did not bring the doctor from Moscow. Kitty tried to help him and comfort him in every possible way, but it was all in vain, and the Avian saw that she herself was worn out physically and mentally, though she would not admit it. That consciousness of death which had been evoked in them all by his farewell to life on the night he had sent for his brother was destroyed. Everyone knew he would soon and inevitably die, but he was already half dead. Everyone wished that he would die quickly, and they all, concealing that feeling, brought him bottles of medicine, went to fetch medicines and doctors, and deceived him and themselves and one another. It was all a lie, a repulsive, insulting, blasphemous lie, and as a result of his character, and because he loved the dying man more than the others, did Leovan felt that lie most painfully. Leovan, who had long wished to reconcile his brothers, even if only at the moment of death, had written to Sergei Ivanitch, and having received his answer, read it to Nikolai. Sergei Ivanitch wrote that he could not come personally, but in touching words asked his brother's pardon. The invalid made no comment. "What am I to write to him?" asked Leovan. "I hope you are not angry with him." "No, I don't," answered Nikolai, vexed at the question. "Tell him to send me a doctor." Another 3 days of torture went by. The sick man was still in the same condition. Everyone who saw him now desired his death: the waiters in the hotel, the proprietor, all the other visitors there, the doctor, Maria Nikolova, Yevgeny, and Kitty. Only the invalid himself did not show that desire, but on the contrary was angry because the doctor had not been fetched, and he continued taking medicine and talking of life only at rare moments. When opium made him forget his incessant sufferings, for a moment did he sometimes, when half asleep, express what was stronger in his soul than in any of the others: "Oh, if only it were over," or "When will this end?" His sufferings regularly increasing did their work of preparing him for death. There was no position that did not cause him pain, no moments of forgetfulness, no part of his body that did not hurt and torment him. Even the memories, impressions, and thoughts within his body now aroused in him the same sort of repulsion as the body itself. The sight of other persons, their words, his own recollections, gave him nothing but pain. Those about him felt this, and unconsciously did not permit themselves either to move freely, talk, or express their own wishes in his presence. His life was quite swallowed up in a consciousness of suffering and a desire to be released from it. It was clear the change was taking place within him. which would bring him to regard death as a fulfillment of his desires, as happiness. Formerly, every separate desire caused by suffering or privation, such as hunger or thirst, was relieved by some bodily action, which brought enjoyment. But now privation and suffering were not followed by relief, but the attempt to obtain relief occasioned fresh suffering. Therefore, all his desires were merged into one, a desire to be released from all this pain and from its source, his body. He had no words to express his desire for this liberation, and therefore did not speak of it, but went on from habit, demanding satisfaction of those wishes that could be fulfilled. "Turn me on the other side," he said, and immediately afterwards asked to be put back as he had been. "Give me some beef tea. Take it away. Tell me something. Why don't you speak then?" As soon as they began to talk, he shut his eyes and expressed weariness, indifference, and disgust. On the 10th day after their arrival in that town, Kitty fell ill. She had a headache, was sick, and could not leave her bed all the morning. The doctor explained her illness as the result of fatigue and agitation, and ordered mental tranquility. After dinner, however, Kitty got up and went as usual to the sick man, taking her embroidery. Nikolai looked at her sternly when she entered and smiled contemptuously. When she said she had been ill that day, he continually blew his nose and moaned piteously. "How do you feel?" she asked him. "Worse," he answered with an effort. "It hurts." "Where does it hurt?" "Everywhere today. It will end, you'll see," said Maria Kovalova in a whisper, but so that the invalid, whose senses were very acute, was, as Levin saw, sure to hear her leave, and said, "Hush," and turned to look at his brother. Nikolai had heard, but the words had no effect on him. His look remained reproachful and strained. "Why do you think so?" Levin asked when she had followed him into the corridor. "He has begun to clutch at himself," replied Maria Kovalova. "Clutch? How like this?" she said, pulling at the folds of her stuffed dress, and Levin noticed that all day long the sick man really kept catching at himself, as if wishing to pull something off. Maria Nikolaevna's prophecy was fulfilled. Toward night, the patient could no longer raise his hands and only gazed straight before him, without changing the attentive, concentrated expression of his eyes, even when his brother or Kitty bent over him so that he could see them. He did not look at them. Kitty sent for the priest to read the prayers for the dying. While the priest read, the dying man showed no sign of life. His eyes were closed. Levin, Kitty, and Maria Nikolaevna stood by the bedside. The prayers were not yet ended when the dying man stretched himself, sighed, and opened his eyes. Having finished the prayer, the priest touched the cold forehead with his cross, which he then wrapped in his stole, and after standing in silence another 2 minutes, touched the enormous bloodless hand, which was growing cold. "He has passed away," said the priest, and turned to go. But suddenly the clammy mustache of the dying man moved, and from the depth of his chest through the stillness came his voice, sharp and distinct. Not quite soon, a moment later, his face brightened. A smile appeared under the mustache, and the women who had gathered round him began zealously to lay out the body. The sight of his brother and the proximity of death renewed in Levin's soul that feeling of horror at the inscrutability, nearness, and inevitability of death which had seized him on that autumn evening when his brother had arrived in the country. That feeling was now stronger even than before. He felt even less able than before to understand the meaning of death, and its inevitability appeared yet more terrible to him. But now, thanks to his wife's presence, that feeling did not drive him to despair in spite of death. He felt the necessity of living and loving. He felt that love had saved him from despair, and that love under the menace of despair grew still stronger and purer. Scarcely had the unexplained mystery of death been enacted before his eyes when another mystery, just as inexplicable, presented itself, calling to love and life. The doctor confirmed their supposition about Kitty. Her illness was pregnancy. Chapter 21. From the moment that Karenin understood from his conversations with Betsy and Oblonsky that all that was asked of him was that he should leave his wife in peace and not trouble her with his presence, and that his wife herself wished this, he felt so lost that he could decide nothing. For himself did not know what he now wanted, and having placed himself in the hands of those who with so much pleasure busied themselves with his affairs, he consented to everything. Only after Anna had left his house, and the English governess sent to ask him whether she was to dine with him or alone, did he for the first time clearly understand his position and he was horror-struck at what was most painful in his situation was his inability to reconcile his past life with the present state of things. It was not the past, when he lived happily with his wife, that perplexed him. The transition from the past to the consciousness of his wife's infidelity. He had already painfully passed through that. Had been trying, but it was comprehensible. Had his wife then, after confessing her infidelity, left him, he would have been grieved and unhappy, but he would not have felt himself to be in such an unintelligible abyss as now.